Good evening, everybody. It's been a while since I've been able to jump on another live stream. Happy to be back. Been busy mixing and traveling and kids and family and all the other fun stuff. So I apologize. It's been a little bit of a lapse, but here we go. Just while we get going here, can everybody give me a thumbs up that the audio and the video is good, please, if you would. And I'm going to keep talking as if it is, and if it's not, well, then you guys will let me know and I'll fix it. Really excited. This is actually the first guest that I've had on a live stream, which is kind of cool because I eventually have a podcast kind of in the works that I'm going to be launching, and ultimately this is basically kind of like the first episode of what that podcast is. So on one hand, it's kind of the first episode of the podcast, and it's also my first guest. And it's I've got an amazing guest today. His name's Chris Hollywood Holmes. We know each other through a few common friends and colleagues. We've worked together on a few projects. We know each other. We know each other's story a little bit, but it's funny how similar we find a lot of the parallels in our stories. Not only the kind of the how we went to the LA and from Canada, all this. I mean, we're going to get into that. It's pretty cool. So we're going to dive in. Chris is an amazing engineer. He mixes, he produces. He actually just finished engineering one of my favorite Canadian bands. Well, they're one of my favorite bands anyways, Big Wreck, with one of my favorite guitar players and singer Ian Thornley, and also with an amazing producer with Nick Raskulinecz. So I'm going to pick his brain on all that and make him spill all the dirt. Before we do that, just want to do a little housekeeping. If you aren't already subscribed to the YouTube channel, please do so. The more people that watch, the more people that subscribe, and the more that the algorithm can kind of get hold of this, and the more we can build our audience, the more I'll be able to really allocate time and do more of them more often. And, it's also nice knowing that we're doing something that you do like. So please give us some thumbs up, subscribe. If you're not following both me and Chris Holmes on Instagram, please go there, find us, follow us there. And we are running a contest right now. We do have Make Believe Studio and Metric Halo are kind of our first unofficial sponsors, and they are giving away a Make Believe plugin bundle. So if you didn't see on Instagram, kind of the general rules are you got to subscribe to both my YouTube channel, Make Believe Studios YouTube channel. You can do a screenshot of this happening while we're doing it, post it, tag us. Basically, we're just trying to spread the word, and we're gonna pick somebody. Maybe what we'll do is we'll give everybody maybe another day to kind of spread the word about these live streams and about Make Believe Studios, who are making amazing plugins that I use quite a bit. And that's one of the reasons why they reached out, is because I was actually using their stuff, and they're like, "Hey, cool, you use our stuff. That's cool. Let's talk shop." And we did, and they're awesome people over there. So, anyways, let's show them some love and support as well, and just kind of spread the word. And I think we are ready to go. So I'm gonna bring in my friend, awesome engineer Chris Hollywood Holmes. Hang on one second, buddy. There he is.
Hey, how's
Chris,
it going?
good. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me and all that.
Thank you so much for joining us and spending your Friday night. And just a warning, these things can get long.
Yeah, I know. I've been around for a few of them, so I know.
Well, you know what? That's actually something I didn't mention. That was kind of the impetus of inviting you on. Was I saw you in the chat. Maybe like one of the first, maybe their second ones that I did. And another thing that I should mention. We did start a Discord server as well. So if you go to my website, go to the bottom of the page, sign up for the mailing list, and I'll send you a link. I send out a link once a week. Right now, the links expire. I'll send those out. So if you didn't get it right away, then just keep your eye out for the next one, or you can email me and ask for one. But yeah, Chris, you've been active in the Discord server as well, which is really cool. We've kind of started to build a little bit of a community there and had some good conversation. So yeah, welcome.
Thanks.
Welcome. We're gonna dig in, and this might get a little historical. It might get a little nerdy. It might, who knows? So buckle up.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's do it.
So let's start. I think most people kind of, I guess, have a little bit of an idea of kind of my story in terms of like, I'm Canadian, went to the States. Now I'm actually back in Vancouver, and yours is kind of similar. So let's kind of start. Like, I mean, you grew up in Prince George.
That's right.
Okay.
PG.
Okay. So
yeah.
Was a musical family? Were your parents, like, how'd you get into music?
No, and that's the part that's kind of funny. Like neither of my parents were really musicians or anything like that. They listened to a lot of music, but I wasn't really exposed to a ton of music as a kid. But it is like retrospectively looking at it. I had a tape recorder and I would do what all the kids in the 80s and 90s did. I would record songs off the radio. And I think, yeah, even at a very young age, that kind of interested me, at least, like being able to record sound and stuff like that. And then when I started to grow up, like I think around 13 or 14, I started playing drums, started playing in bands. And then I realized along the way that it'd be fun to like record that stuff, like my own projects and things like that.
Yeah.
Started doing that, realized I like that way more than playing live and
Okay,
being in a band.
I'm gonna jump in for a second. Okay, so you were like 14 playing the drums?
Yep.
What were you listening to when you were 14? Like what got you into drums? Like what made, I mean, every kid wants to play drums. The fact that your parents let you play drums is pretty awesome, by the way. My parents were like, you're not getting a drum kit. But like, what were you listening to at the time that you were like, I want to play along, like, or I want to start a band that sounds like this?
So it's pretty stereotypical of the time period, but for me, it was really guys like Dave Grohl, like Nirvana was a big one. And then Lars Ulrich on the Metallica side. Like that was kind of the two that kind of drove me towards that. And I already had friends who played guitar. So I figured the only way I'd get into a band is if I played one of the things that somebody else didn't already play.
Yeah.
And my dad knew a guy who was a drummer, and he was like, I have an absolute garbage drum kit just sitting in my garage. You can have it. And I think my dad probably instantly regretted it when I started playing. I don't think he realized how loud they were going to be, but they let me keep doing it. They let me have people over and jam and all that kind of stuff. And they were always really supportive of the whole thing.
So when you started recording, I remember being in a very, like I said, our stories are so similar. I didn't get to play drums. I was playing guitar, but probably around the same era time period as when I was kind of doing the same thing. When you said you got into recording your own stuff, like, so like, let's be detailed on this. Like, what did that look like when you were 15 or 16 and you're like, I want to record my drums or I want to record my band? Walk us through what that looked like.
So it's funny. The first recording medium I had was my dad's work laptop, which ran like, maybe it was Windows 95. It was probably Windows 3.1 though.
Yep.
And it had a voice memo app, and he had a dictation microphone for something. I don't even know what he used it for. And we used to just like put the laptop in the middle of the room and play. And I wish I could hear it now, but it was probably just complete distorted nonsense. So then we'd move the laptop a little bit further away. We started doing that. And then it became very clear very quickly that wasn't going to work. Like it just sounded like the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
But I was fortunate because I had gotten a job at a hotel, and it was like a summer gig where you basically just carried luggage for tourists and things like that.
Okay.
And so as like a 14, 15-year-old kid, I had way more money than I should have had at that time.
Nice.
So I bought a Roland, what was it called?
VS
880.
880. Yeah. I was about to say 840, but it was 880. I remember those.
Yeah. Yeah. And then so I did 8 tracks on that, and I kind of got like a feel for it. I bought some weird 4-pack of microphones. And then like my big upgrade was I got the 1680. So I had 16 tracks.
Yep.
And then I bought a D112, a 57, and 2 AKG 4033s. Wow. And I figured that's kick, snare, and a pair of overheads. like that seemed like a big deal to me. And then I could use the 57 for whatever else, a 433 for vocals, and I figured that would kind of cover it. And then a weird thing happened where everything I recorded sounded bad. And I didn't realize that there was like more to it than just like buying the equipment, and that kind of fueled the interest in it, I think.
Hmm.
And so I did it as much as I could, all the time, and it just kind of evolved into the thing I cared the most about. Drumming kind of became second, and being in the band was just a vehicle to do the recording. And then so it like, I don't know, this fast forward like 2 or 3 years, and I was getting out of high school, and I was like, "What am I gonna do now?" I kinda wanted to do the whole engineering thing. I didn't even really fully understand what that even meant.
Yeah.
Um, but I started looking at schools in Canada and all that kind of stuff, and there was definitely options, but I'm like, if I'm gonna do this, I wanna go to, like, a recording mecca. I
Yeah.
wanna go somewhere where it's, like, big, big stuff. So there was this school at the time, it was called Los Angeles Recording Workshop, and I think
Hmm.
it's called something else now.
Yep.
And I was like, "Okay." So we went down and looked at the school, and it seemed pretty good, and, like, the staff was really nice and all that. Went down, went
You
to school.
went down with like your parent. Like, how old were you when you decided to go down? Like, just out of
I
high
think it's
school?
probably, like, 18 or 17 or 18, somewhere in there, maybe even 19 at the time.
So, did your
Well,
parents go down with you? Were they
yeah,
supportive of
like,
this?
yeah, but I think my dad was probably a little not skeptical, but he probably wanted to see, like, what it was we were gonna do.
Yeah.
So we went down to the school, and, like, they actually did a really good job of, like, portraying what it is they do and showing us around the school, and, like, they made my dad, I feel, pretty at ease, I think.
That's good.
Um, so I think, like, 9 months later or something, I started the program, and pretty much as soon as I got there, I kinda realized, like, this is a little egotistical, but I think I cared more than a lot of the people in the program.
Yeah.
Like, pretty quickly, I realized, like, I had a lot more interest in it than some of the other people that were there, and I was, like, bribing people for their lab time with beer and things like that. So, like,
And
because we'd only
they
have
were
limited.
gladly giving it to you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because 'cause it'd be like, we only got so many hours, and they had an SSL, like I think it was like a 4000E or something.
Yep.
We only had so many hours in a week in there. So I would bribe other students to take their time so I could get more time on the console and all that kind of stuff. And then one thing led to another, and then a friend of mine who was working at the school kind of said like, "Hey, my boyfriend works at this other studio, and they're looking for runners. Do you want to, go and see if you can intern or run or whatever?" And I was like, "Of course." I'm like, "Whose studio is it?" And they're like, "Oh, it's this place called like the Mix Room." She doesn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And I knew immediately. I'm like, "That's fucking Ben Gross's studio,
Yeah.
like 100%." And like Ben is one of my biggest, people who had the biggest influence on me, I think.
So for, I mean, I probably run into Ben maybe a couple times, and I think maybe I spoke to him on the phone a few times. What the entire time I was in LA, so I don't know him that well. But like in LA, I mean, in the music business, like he's a heavy hitter.
Yeah.
And so for the people who don't know, like what would be something like, let's say that like top 3 or 5 things that Ben had done that you were like, that's my shit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the big ones for Ben was he did the first Filter record.
Yep.
He did the really big Fuel record, that
Yep.
huge one. And
Yep.
then for me, it was he did Seven Dust's Animosity.
Yeah.
And then um he did one of Manson's records too that sounds really good. I can't remember which one it was now, but it's the one that around 2003 or something like that. So, like, it was huge for me because I'm like, I was big into Seven Dust at the time, and I thought Animosity was like the best sounding record ever. And then I got to start running at his studio. Didn't get to like work with him directly or anything, but just like being in the building and getting him his Caesar salad every day was like a pretty big thing for me. And then eventually, like it always does in a studio, like you stick around long enough and don't mess up, they
Yeah.
let you do other stuff. So then Ben started to have me do the recalls,
Mm-hmm.
and that's when I started to kind of like learn some stuff that he did and all that kind of stuff. And
Okay, so I'm gonna jump in again, and just forgive me for interrupting, but
that's okay.
a lot of, I would say, the viewers, I'd say the enthusiasts, recording enthusiasts right now who are watching this, or who, I mean, even if they were around at the time, like a lot of people don't know what that looks like. Again, I
That's fair.
talking about your like your home recording setup. Like mine was the same way. I used to rent like Porta Studios, like the Tascam Porta Studios and a bunch of
Yeah.
57s, right? Um, explain kind of like what, because when you say, okay, I was running and then he let me do recalls, some people are like, oh, okay, well, that's the next like lowest thing on the totem pole. But like recalls is kind of important. And so if you're gonna have somebody do a recall, like that right out of the gate is like, okay, this guy, like, although it's kind of a shitty job, it's an important job, right? And I've done way too many recalls. I never want to do another recall again. But like, so explain to somebody like what that entails, and then maybe I'll kind of highlight what happens if that's not done correctly.
Yeah. So recalling is basically when somebody has to pull up a song that they've been working on. And especially, this was 2002. A lot of stuff was not saved in the computer.
Yeah.
So I basically had a few different parts I had to do. I had to do what they call total recall on the console or on the board. So his board was an 80 channel 9000K from SSL.
Okay.
So it would basically, this thing would come up on a screen with a bunch of colored knobs, and you'd have to turn each knob into the right position. And then when you got a whole channel done, it would jump to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And the 8 or the 9000s were really, really sensitive. Like you had to be bang on or it wouldn't stick. So you repeat that 80 times, and that takes you like 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay, so again, I'm gonna jump in. So you're literally, and I know I've done this too, but I want everybody to understand. You are literally moving potentially like every knob on that 80 channel board back to whatever place it was when you saved that recall, when Ben is like, I'm done for the night. I'm gonna save this. And we're gonna recall this in a week when the band's back in town from the tour, and you got to go and put every single knob on that 80 channel board back to where it was.
Yeah, and it's like I think it's somewhere in the range of, depending on how crazy the recall was, it's anywhere from 800 to like 1500 knobs that have to had
Yeah,
and
that's just the console. Like that's not the outboard gear. That's not the patch bay. Yeah.
And then he had an assistant at the time named Chuck. Chuck would do all the patching, and he would do most of the rack gear, if not almost all of it. And then there was just like, he would slowly let me do one or two things.
Yeah.
But the rack gear was something that had to be like absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
I don't think I was quite there yet with Ben. He would let me do it in the B room because he had a second room which had a 64 channel 9000J in it, like a big SSL too.
Yep.
And I would do a lot for the other clients, but Ben would let me do his console. That was pretty much it. But that was enough for me because I could go into the room and kind of get an idea of like how things are routed and where things went and all that kind of stuff. So it was like trying to learn what Ben's doing without actually hearing anything he's doing, if that makes sense. Like I'd just be able to see the routing. And
how long did it take you from like going from like I'm just worried about not fucking up to now you're turning knobs being like, oh, I see what he did on the snare, or like, oh, I see what he's doing. Like, were you paying that attention right away, or are you just like, don't fuck up, don't fuck up, don't fuck up?
I think both things happened in tandem. Like I think I became pretty aware of what he was doing, and I had a notebook that I filled up with all kinds of stuff.
Cool.
But I was in a constant state of anxiety while I was working on Ben's stuff.
Yeah.
Because he's a super nice guy, but he's also very particular and very direct when he is not happy.
Yeah.
And so my whole thing was just like, don't make Ben mad, don't make Ben mad, don't make Ben mad. And I'm just sitting there like turning the knobs and all that kind of stuff. But like you do, I don't know how many I ended up doing, probably like 30 or 50 of them in the time I was there.
Yeah.
You kind of start to notice patterns and like, oh, this is always here, this is always there. And then, you just kind of like, it's like anything else. Like once you see it a few times, you start to pick up on more detail than you did the last time. And then you kind of get at least a ballpark image of what it is the guy does.
Are there any things that you wrote down in that book that has become kind of like a part of, when I say a part of who you are in terms of like your work, when you go to mix a song now, or when you're, when you come across a certain scenario of a problem in a mix that you need to solve, is there something in that playbook that you were taking notes that you're like, oh dude, like that, I do that every day still. Like,
yeah, absolutely. There was. And I think the biggest one is, and this is kind of to show you like how green I was at the time, is like I sat down and I was doing the first recall or whatever, and like I couldn't figure out because he on those 9000s they had like the main two bus where you'd have your left and right, and then
Yeah.
he had four other two buses
Yeah.
that
The
was
A,
like
B,
the
C, D.
A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
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 And I couldn't figure out, I was like, what is the point of this? And then Chuck, the assistant guy, was just like, well, it's all of his parallel buses. And to me, I was like, what do you mean? You only do parallel compression on drums? Because that was basically what I was taught. And it'd
Yeah.
be one thing.
Yeah.
And he was just like, no, no, no. He's like, Ben's got these four different like colors or palettes, and he'll blend into them whenever he needs something.
Interesting.
And I don't necessarily do it like Ben does, because I think that's almost kind of like that Michael
Well,
Brower
I was
kind
about
of
to
thing.
ask. That's a little like Michael Brower-esque,
Yeah.
right? So he was treating them less about when I say Ben was treating them less about like drums, guitars, percussion and keyboards and vocals, and he was more looking at it like, okay, so A is going to be like the mid range and B is going to be like the bottom end. Like how is he kind of laying it out?
It's kind. I got to be honest. It's kind of hard for me to know exactly what his mentality was.
Yeah, but how
I do.
did that transfer to what you do?
Well, the thing was for me is he had like A. I can't remember what A was, but B I remember very clearly. B was an Empirical Labs Fatso,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember because I had done all his recalls. One day I was in the other studio, and I'm like, I just want to see what this does.
Yeah.
So I pulled up a drum session, mimicked what he did, and suddenly I was like, oh wow, the drums suddenly sound good. Like instantly, I was like, what did I even do?
Yeah.
And it kind of made me realize that whole thing of like, you can't always squeeze what you want out of a sound. Sometimes you have to like have the sound as it is and then blend something else in to kind of
Yeah.
make it work,
Yeah.
right?
Very much. Yeah.
And there was just like other stuff too. Like he used a Neve 33609 on
Mm-hmm.
his stereo bus instead of the SSL compressor, which
Yep.
I thought was interesting. Like I'd never seen that. He'd rent a 670 Fairchild every so often when it was like a real big project to run the whole mix through.
Yep.
But I think the biggest thing I took from him, and I think a lot of mixers know this now, is he kind of had just chains, and those chains wouldn't really change, and it's what he would feed into them and how hard he would drive it or whatever. Like, he'd have Neve EQs on his guitar bus, he'd have this on this or whatever. And I kind of realized that a lot of these guys, like especially like him, and there was a couple other mixers who came through the studio, they all kind of like set these things up, and then they would try to put sounds through them, and if it worked, great, and if it didn't, they wouldn't change the chain, they would just change where that thing was going.
Mm.
So it's this whole idea of like templating basically, right? And you look at Chris Lord-Alge or any of those guys, they talk about it like he doesn't change the knobs on his gear, it just
Yeah.
stays where it is. And I
Yeah.
think Ben to a degree is kind of like that. I mean, at least it seemed like he was at the time.
Yeah. And is that
Yeah.
something that you do? Are you mixing mainly in the box, or do you have hardware?
Yeah,
What?
100% in the box.
So chains are obviously a lot easier. Number one,
Yeah.
to set up and recall, and also to tweak a little bit. But do you still kind of work in a similar fashion?
Yeah.
Are you in Pro Tools?
Yes, Pro Tools for sure.
Okay. So are you building track presets, and you're just like, oh, I got a guitar, I'm going to pull up this track preset, or what? Like,
Yeah.
what's your process on something like that?
I have a template that I've used like permutations of it over the years, but basically I have like a bunch of tracks with the certain routing that I need and all that kind of stuff. And then within those tracks, I have like a couple. The first two slots will be like one potential chain. The next two slots will be like the next one. So whenever I pull something up, I can usually just click those on and start moving stuff. I don't really preset them that much. Like it's
Yeah.
not like I have an EQ already set, but I'm
Yeah.
like, this song probably I can just do with the SSL. This one's going to need Pro Q, and I can just click them on. And
Yeah.
I have it kind of set up where I have like a couple different saturations, a couple different like channel strip things, and then for drums I'll have like a transient designer. If it's vocals, there might be, even though I've never actually had it end up on a song, I have like Sooth in there or something, and then and it changes I wouldn't say fairly frequently, but I update it here and there, and then sometimes I use it less, sometimes I use it more. But the model of it hasn't really changed much.
Interesting.
It's basically like I have subgroups that feed into like larger groups, and then they feed into basically what I guess you could call stems, and then those feed into my master bus kind of thing.
So are you doing in the box? Are you doing a little bit of that kind of like parallel ABCD bus thing?
Yeah, I
kind of
mean,
a
I
version of
actually
it?
used to mimic it exactly.
Yeah.
And then I've kind of moved away from it now where it's mostly drums where I do the most parallel stuff
Yeah.
and vocals sometimes. But like I think I was talking about this on the Discord. Like my drum thing is basically the same thing I know a bunch of people do, where it's like I have a kind of like an unprocessed drum bus,
Yep.
and then I have a bus that I use to like accentuate attack, one that I use to accentuate sustain, and then a third one that I call the tone bus, but it's kind of variable where it's like I need more of this in XYZ, and then
Yeah.
that's kind of what I juice it up with. Um, and I find that like I don't know, like I know everyone's different, but for me, I find in the way I mix, I tend to make things too tacky or too like
Yep. Yep.
too much attack, not enough body. So I'm always trying to find ways to like where I could just be like, wow, this is like there's no body to anything, and then I can just push up a fader and I kind of gain it back. That's what I try to do, anyways.
Yeah. No, that's smart. That's smart. And then that's, again, we've actually never spoken about this. It's funny. Like, we've never had this conversation before. We've never really compared notes before, but it's something very similar. I do something very similar where I've got my main parallel drum bus is, I don't call it a sustain bus, but that's why I started using it, was because I, very much like you, I would mix and then I would kind of get 50, 60, 70% of the way through and be like, my drums just sound like tick, 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 just all like transient. And so then I'm like, I need to bring up all the stuff between the transients, but I don't want to change what I got because there's a part of it that's good. And so like that's what my parallel bus was. And then as the years went on, it's kind of like, okay, well now I need that like smacky, like Randy Staub thing back. So it's like, then I added another one.
Yeah.
I like the idea of the tone, having a third all like set up and being, like you said, like the tone. It's like, and you can kind of make it whatever, but at least it's set up, ready to go. I really like that idea. That's awesome.
Yeah, and like it all depends. Like sometimes I go way over the top with the drum compression, and then I just need more clarity in the cymbals. So sometimes I just route raw cymbals to it and just push them back in to clear it up a little bit.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's the opposite where I'll feed like the kick and snare and just absolutely nuke it to
Yeah.
get something and then blend that in too or whatever.
How particular are you with like which compressor you use? Like, are you like, oh, it's got to be like that one, or you're kind of like, whatever, I'll just demolish it with whatever I got?
I have ones that I like.
Yeah, of course.
But mostly because I am either used to them or I like the user interface.
Yep.
And it's funny though, because like if I ever get into a position where I feel like I need to like set my compression, I use like either Pro C2 or the stock compressor sometimes, just because I'm like, I don't need an interface getting in the way. I just need to punch some numbers in and move the threshold knob and figure it out.
Yeah.
But I really like the API 2500.
Yeah.
A friend of mine named John actually gave me a really cool preset for that I've used pretty much since he gave it to me. I really like the 33609. I've been using the IK multimedia one.
Interesting.
For a while. Again, it's like I just found a setting I liked, and now I basically don't touch it. It's just like either it works or it doesn't.
And what do you use that on?
That's just kind of like usually it'll either be on that sustain bus,
Yeah.
kind of set weird, or sometimes I add it to the whole drum mix to kind of like clamp down after I've done a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And then I have the weirdest one in my chain is Waves has this plugin called Omnichannel.
Yep.
It's like some Andrew Sheps thing.
Yep.
And in there's a preset from Chenzo Townsend or whatever, some UK mixer guy.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's literally just called like parallel kick snare. And I use that on my attack bus because that's basically all it is. So I just literally load that preset up, and then there's your kick and snare, like the spike, basically. And then there's like some other ones, like I've tried a couple distressor ones, and sometimes I use the Renaissance Axe, which is like another kind of interesting one. I can't even remember what else, but I've tried like a bunch of stuff, but I seem to always end up back at like these same kind of ones. Like I'll be totally honest, I'm not crazy about the IK multimedia plugins. They seem to crash a lot. The metering doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
But I can't get away from the way they sound. Like
Interesting.
There's just something about them that they just keep working. I haven't really found something to replace it, I guess.
Yeah, I work with a guy who uses a producer that I do some mixing for. He uses a couple IK multimedia plugins like religiously, and I mean, I obviously I'll keep them on whatever he sends me, and just kind of as a starting point. I've never really like dug into them, but I'm like, Nothing bugs me about them, but like there is one in particular that does crash a lot. So I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it's interesting how, like, I try to, when people ask, they want specifics. What do you use? What are your settings? Blah, blah, blah. And like, I try to almost shy away from sometimes like getting too detailed, because I think the tendency is to just copy and just be like, oh, I need to add 6 dB of 70 hertz on my kick drum.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, not if the kick drum has 10 dB too much of 70 hertz.
Yes.
Then you're fucking yourself. So it's so context and specific to whatever whatever you're actually doing. And yeah, some people send kick drums. Like when I'm tracking, I EQ I call it 2-tape. I'll EQ on the way in. So when there's no plugins on anything, it already sounds pretty good. Well, I'm already adding a bunch of shit ton of bottom end and a shit ton of top end to a kick drum, and I'm carving out the middle. So if you go then put do what somebody told you to do in a worksheet, like that's potentially going to make it sound like really bad.
I've had this literal same conversation with a bunch of people, and I 100% agree with what you're saying. Like, to me, it's wild when I see stuff where it's like, add 6 dB at 200 hertz on a snare. And then I always ask the question, what happens if the snare already has too much 200 hertz?
Yeah.
Now you're just adding more to it for no reason.
Yeah,
right?
totally. Yeah, and it's interesting how, like, that's not the answer that people want, because ultimately they just want they want the right answer, as opposed to they understanding the fact that there is no right answer. It's all dependent on, like, well, and also too much 200 hertz to you might be different than 200 hertz to me. Although, based off of all of our other similarities, I bet you we'd probably be in the same ballpark on that as well. But it's an interesting thing, and I think, like, just with plugins and presets and stuff like that, I think it's become very much a thing of like, well, what was your setting? And it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, it changes all the time. And yes, you have a starting point, but ultimately you got to use your ears to figure out like what's going on.
And I was that person for a long time, where I'd ask people like, what did you, okay, give me exactly what you did.
Yeah.
And then I would be like almost upset when it didn't work.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's like, wow, they didn't tell me one part of it. Clearly there's a secret they're not telling. And it's like, no, it's just like, your sound is different than theirs. It's never going to be the same.
I recently just had a conversation with somebody literally explaining this same phenomenon. And I it's not even what somebody else did. It's what I did. And, somebody was talking to me about potentially doing a mix, and they referenced a song that I mixed, I don't know, 6 months ago, whatever it was. And they're like, okay, can you just, like, we want it like this. If you can make it sound like that, like, we're going to be extremely happy. Right. And they're like, so are you able to like go open that session and like save all your settings? And I'm like, that's not going to work. And they started like not debating with me, but there was a conversation about why that doesn't work. And I said, I'll tell you something right now. Let's take the last Nickelback album, which by the way, you worked on with me. The drums were basically recorded the same way from song to song. The samples, although relatively similar, there were a little bit of differences. There were so many times where it's like, I would finish one of the mixes on that album and I was like, oh, this sounds incredible. And then I would like go start the next one. And I'm like, I could just bring all the settings over and I'm halfway done. And I'd bring all the settings over and I'd adjust a few things. I'd be like, this sounds like shit. That's not going to work. And it's like, I mean, relatively speaking, but I couldn't just slap, even though it was the same drum kit and it was this similar samples, if not the same samples, like it didn't work. The fact that the drum pattern was different, the tuning of the song was different, the tempo is different, all this stuff is different. What does that song feel like? It's like, well, this song doesn't need a big giant boomy kick drum. This song needs something else. I'll try to shoehorn a big boomy kick drum in there somehow, but even if it doesn't need it. But it's definitely a thing where I feel like a lot of people don't understand that. And then if it does work, they're like, well, see, that worked. And it's like, no, that doesn't work all the time. Like you got lucky. So yeah, why not? Bring it in, try it out. You might get lucky, but that can't be the plan. That can't be your career can't hinge upon you setting plugin settings once and then using them for the next like 4 years of your career. That doesn't work.
No.
So
And like you said, I think tuning and tempo is such a huge part of it. Like,
yeah,
yeah, like
yeah,
especially with drum stuff, right? Like if you have a 4 on the floor beat, even just taking half of those kick drums out
yeah,
totally changes what you can do with the low end on something, right?
yeah.
So, and then you start adding 8s and 16ths, and then that fucking low end is useless to you now,
Yep,
right?
totally. Yeah, 100%. You something completely different. And so you got to be aware of that. It's very context and situation specific. So,
Yeah.
well, let's kind of get back to, okay, so you're in LA, you went to school. Are you still going to school while you're working at Ben's place?
No, I basically finished
Okay.
school. I think I started, well, that's not true. I think I started at the mix room when I was in my last like 6 weeks or something. But basically I was done school. Um, I was working for Ben. And I think I moved
Where
up.
were you living?
Uh, I was in, so my entire time in LA, I basically moved across the valley.
Okay.
So I started in North Hollywood,
Yeah.
and then when I started working for Ben, I moved to Burbank because that's kind of like
Yep.
where he was.
Yep.
And then later on, I ended up going basically back to North Hollywood and then out to Van Nuys and then to Tarzana.
Gotcha.
So I just slowly moved in that direction in the
You
valley.
you would have been in the ocean by now if you never came back to Canada.
Exactly.
So,
But yeah, so I was working with Ben, and I got moved up from just being an intern to like actually getting paid and being a runner and all that kind of stuff.
yeah.
Um, and I was really happy, to be honest. I was meeting lots of cool people. I was doing like, I wasn't assisting or anything like that, but I was learning a lot from the people that were.
Yep.
But I did notice something. There was this guy named Paul Pavo who was like ahead of me. He was the guy one thing up on the ladder.
Yep.
And when Chuck, the other assistant, decided to leave, Ben picked up Paul as being his assistant. And I just got this feeling, I'm like, Ben or Paul's never going to leave. Like he is now Ben's guy forever.
Yeah.
And he is to this day, I will say as
Oh,
well.
really?
So he absolutely, like, he's done a lot of stuff with Ben. He's basically like co-mixed a bunch of records with him and stuff, but he hasn't
Gotcha.
left.
Yeah.
So I started getting this feeling like there may be a ceiling on how far I can go here.
Mm.
And I started talking with my friend from the school, and she was basically like, "Well, have you ever heard of this production team called The Matrix?" And I'm like, "Yeah, they just did Avril's new record or first record."
Yeah. That
And
was
it's like
the massive one. Yeah. Like that.
a huge one.
Yeah.
I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, "They're doing like literally a cattle call. They want 50 resumes from the school
Wow.
because they need a new assistant." And I just said, and she said, "Do you want me to put your resume in?" And I'm like, "Yep, 100%." So I didn't really think much of it. And then like a couple weeks later, I got a call from Scott Spock, the one
Yep.
of the producers, and he's like, "Hey, do you want to come in for an interview?" And I'm like, "Sure." So I go in for this interview, and it was like he had basically built a factory where I would show up, and as I'm walking in the door, the last person's leaving, and he's like, "We have literally 13 and a half or 15 minutes. Let's go." And it wasn't an interview. It was basically like an audio Olympics kind of thing where he put me in front of his rig, and he had all these hardware synths and stuff.
Yeah.
And he's like, "I need you to explain to me how I get sound from the keyboard up there into Pro Tools." And I
Yeah.
was just like kind of panicked, but I'm like, MIDI controller into the MIDI interfaces, MIDI feeds into those feed into your Apogee, or I forget what he had, some interfaces, and that gets into Pro Tools.
Yeah.
And like Scott had a pretty good poker face, so he's just like, "Okay." So we go on to the next thing. And then the last thing we had to do was like this arrangement edit of a song, but he actually picked a really tricky song that they had produced where the third chorus doesn't actually start on the one. It's like there's like a missed beat, and then it starts on the two.
Yep.
And I botched the edit the first time. I didn't figure it out. And then he said to me, he's like, "Well, yeah, it starts on the two." And then I was able to just like snip, snip, snip and just fix it, and then played it for him. And he was just like, "Okay." And then he kind of like very casually, as I'm going to the door, he's like, "How old are you again?" And I'm like, "I'm 20." He's like, "Okay."
Yeah.
So I left, and then I got back to the studio, and Ben was there with Chuck, and this is like really close to when Chuck was leaving. And Chuck was like, "Hey, how was your interview with the Matrix?" And Ben was like, "What are you talking about? You what? You had an interview with the Matrix?" I was like, yeah." And he's like, "Oh, cool. So you're gonna just like abandon us?" Or he said something kind of like half joking or whatever.
Yeah. Half joking.
Yeah. But then I didn't hear anything for like a week or something like that. And I was just like, "Oh, okay, well, whatever."
Yeah.
So week later, I get the call from Scott again, and or no, sorry, before I got a call from Scott, I sent him an email, and I was just like, "Hey, just, thanks for seeing me. Hopefully I did all right. By the way, my current employer, Ben Gross, wanted me to just say hi because Ben had actually asked me, he's like, "If you see them, say hi."
Oh,
And
nice.
then Scott called me back and he's like, "Hey, do you wanna come in for, like, a second interview?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So I go there, and that's when I met Lauren and Graham, the other 2 partners.
Yep.
And, we kinda talked for a minute, and then Scott was like, "Look, it's between you and one other person. Are you interested if we do this?" And he kinda went over some logistical stuff, and I was like, "Yeah, I am, 100%." And I think what it came down to is the other person, was, like, probably late 20s, early
Uh,
30s and had, like, a family.
I was gonna say they were 43 and 4 kids.
Yeah, and I think Scott looked at it like, "Hmm, who's gonna work harder, the 20-year-old kid with no attachments
Yeah.
or this guy?" And so they told me I got the job, and I honestly didn't believe him at first. I was just like, "What? Are you serious?" He's like, "Yeah, you can start," like it was like I think he said, like, the next Monday, not the one coming up, but the one after that. And it was kind of funny because, like, after I'd gotten the job and I'd gotten to know Scott, like, he even told me, he's like, "Yeah, you working for Ben definitely helped." He's like, "'Cause I'm a huge Ben Gross fan," and he's like, "I figured I could pick your brain about some stuff he does and all that
Oh,
kind of stuff."
really? Oh,
And
interesting.
I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah." So, I started working there, and it was just like from day 1, it was just, like, the most insane chaos, but amazing at the same time. Because they were like, they were 18 months, maybe 2 years out from that Avril record coming out, so this is kinda like at the peak of their
S-
or, like, their appeal, I guess, for labels and
So
stuff.
yeah, so it just again to give everybody an idea of in what 2005, when was this, 2006,
2004,
2004?
2005,
Okay,
somewhere in there.
so things are a little different now, but back then and even before that, if you had a big record and a big record like that made a lot of money, and even though Napster had kind of come in, it like that was still a big deal. And so when you have a hit like that, you literally will have a lineup of every A-list artist, every new artist signing by a big label, every manager. Like you literally have your pick of the litter. Let's say. I mean, that still happens a little bit, but it's not as crazy as it was. Like, I feel like now everybody kind of has their group of people they go to, and if those people have a number 1, great. If those people have a number 20, whatever, they like working with them, they like what they do. Occasionally, somebody changes the game and gets all the business for about a year or two. But back then, it was like that's almost who you picked. That you would say, "We're going to make a record." I think they did Kelly Clarkson's first record, right? My
No,
no.
they did some Christina Aguilera
Oh,
stuff. They did
maybe
a
that's
bunch
what
of
it was.
Shakira, like, all kinds of wild things. Hilary Duff was another big one for them.
So yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much anybody who had a female pop star was like
yeah,
Matrix.
yeah,
So you guys had just like endless.
planned.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, my first day, though, was probably the most interesting because I got there and there was this girl on the couch, and it ended up being Katy Perry, but at the time, it was just
Nobody
like
knew who
it
she
was
was.
just
Yeah,
this girl named Katy that they were
yeah,
kinda, like, doing development with. And we're roughly around the same age. I think she's like a year younger than me or something, and she
yeah.
was just like, "Oh, you got the job. That's great. This should be fun," and all that. And so I started getting to the ropes, and then it just like it escalated really quickly where it was kind of like, okay, so today we're working with this new artist for Columbia or whoever it was.
Yeah.
And then the next day we're doing Katie stuff. And then the day after that, we were working with this girl named Jade Maria, who was like the Clairol girl because she had some big commercial out at the time and all this stuff.
Okay.
And it was just like every day was somebody different, and it was endless, like
And what were you
6
guys?
days
I
a week.
mean, I know like the Matrix. They wrote, they produced, they recorded, like they did kind of
Yeah.
everything. So when you were working there, like what was your, at least when you first started, what was like, again, kind of digging into a little bit of that, like what was your role there? What was a day like, day to day in that crazy chaos?
Yeah, so the basic schedule for it was we worked 6 days a week. That was the like, right off the gate, Scott told me, he's like, "We're doing basically 10 to 8 Monday through Saturday. That's the start." And kinda like working at a studio, I started like, even though it's only me, it was just me and them, they didn't have any other staff.
Yeah.
It was basically I started at the bottom. So I started out with just getting the studio ready in the morning and then doing the runs and all that kind of stuff, going out and get people lunch.
Yep.
And then slowly it started to turn into more of that. So I would get like vocal stuff set up. And then if Scott couldn't be there, or if Lauren wanted to track an idea, I would run Pro Tools for her.
Yep.
And then it just like little by little, without even really realizing it, they gave me more and more stuff to do. So I'd be like editing drums, or I would be tracking vocals with Katy while they were off doing something else, or, you know, whatever. And it kind of became, I went from being the person who got them lunch to kind of doing a lot more than that, we'll just say.
Yeah.
Um,
How
but generally,
much was that coming to you saying, can you do this? And how much of that was you kind of being like, oh, did you want me to do like how was that dynamic, like crossing over that kind of threshold? Do you remember?
like, I think after I'd been there for about like 6 months, and like the cobwebs had kind of been washed away, and it was kind of like we're in a routine now where I'm
Yeah.
like part of the team. I'm not like maybe getting fired or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
I think it turned into this thing where I like would ask Scott, like I asked Scott, well, I remember this pretty vividly. I asked him like, hey, because they have backup drives of everything they've ever done.
Yeah.
I was like, do you mind if I open up some of those sessions and just like practice mixing in them or whatever? And he said, yeah. But I think he took that more of like, this guy wants to do more.
Yes.
And then he kind of started to allow me to do some stuff. But it was also like it was, sometimes I got thrown in the deep end where it was just like, hey, we need you to edit all this stuff. And, you know, something I can do in a couple hours now, I had never done
But
before. And I'm
back
like,
then
oh,
you're figuring it out.
figuring it out and
Yeah.
spending it like 12 hours cutting something together or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just kind of, and there was it wasn't really stressful, but there was definitely a pace to their place where everything moved pretty quickly. And like, especially when Scott was like, if Scott's running tools and Lauren's kind of like co-coaching a vocalist and Graham's there with his ideas too.
Yep.
The three of them had a really interesting dynamic and like how quickly they could get someone to do something, right? So they'd sing the lead vocal, and then Graham or Lauren or Scott would be like, hey, try this harmony. And they would just sing it to the person.
Yep.
And I was like absolutely blown away at how quickly they could get those ideas out of their heads and like at the person.
Yeah.
And, you know, there was just a certain fluidity to how they work together, because I guess they'd been doing it for a while.
Yep.
So most of the time I would just be sitting there trying to understand what was happening. like if I'm being totally honest, like there was just
Yeah.
some times where they would be doing stuff so quickly. I'm like, okay, so wait, so now, and like it was a lot about like production stuff where I'm like, okay, so they're tripling the choruses, they're adding these couple different harmonies, and then they're adding like whisper tracks or whatever.
Yep.
And I started to realize, I'm like, oh, there's more to it than just like a vocal.
Yeah.
And then I started to kind of learn more of that stuff. Yeah, and then I don't know, we just kind of like it just became really comfortable and really fun for me. And like we started doing some really cool stuff. Like we did stuff with Mandy Moore and Vanessa Carlton, and I think even Ricky Martin came in for like one day, and they were doing
Nice.
a demo. Because a lot of what they did was song pitching.
Yes.
They would record a demo, send it off, and if it got picked up, great. If it didn't, then on to the next, basically.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until like I think when we did that See You on the Other Side for Korn, that was the first time we sat down and like really did a record, like a full record with a band, and that's when it became like less of the demo-y kind of stuff and more of like we're making an album now.
So forgive me, that Korn record the Matrix did?
Mm-hmm.
No shit. I didn't know that.
Yeah. They
And is that the one with Twisted Transistor and was it Coming Undone?
Yep.
That was the Matrix.
Yeah, so half the record is Atticus Ross, who's now like basically half of Nine Inch Nails.
Yeah.
And then basically anything that was remotely poppy was the Matrix.
Wow, I had no idea. I don't know.
Yeah,
I feel like I should have known that, and I didn't.
Yeah, so what basically happened was Jonathan Davis was, to my knowledge, he was basically just going around town, and he was interviewing a bunch of producers, and what their goal was is they wanted a top 5 Billboard song. That's what they wanted.
Yeah.
So I don't know how many producers it ended up being, but they basically did like tryouts where we'd all come to the studio for a day, do a song with them or a part or something. And then we would leave and they would say yes or no. And I think like, I could be wrong about this, but I feel like it was like 20 or 30, like pretty big producers.
Probably at that time. And they were like, they were, I mean, they're still a big deal now, but like, and obviously before that, but like that was still a big time for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening is we went into the studio. And Scott and the gang kind of like had them track a bunch of riffs to loops and stuff. And like basically what ended up happening is they put together a song, and then we came in the next day and the band lost their minds. They were like, this is fucking incredible. And that basically solidified, like, okay, fuck meeting anyone else. Like, these are the people that are going to do it. And they had already decided that Atticus Ross was going to be at least involved in some way.
Yeah.
So what ended up happening basically is we split the record in half, and we did one half and Atticus did the other half. And that's why if you listen to that album, it's like there's like two polar opposites
Yeah.
track to track. It's so
I remember
bizarre.
that. I do remember that. And that explains a lot now.
Yeah. And then yeah, like the Twisted Transistor and Coming Undone were like the two big singles and all that stuff. And there
Yeah.
was like, but that was, oh God, I want to say that was like 5 or 6 months, maybe 7 months building that record. And like we would just go there every day, track riffs. The team would, you know, they would put arrangements together, they would show it to the band, and then the band would make some corrections, and then Lauren would work with Jonathan on, you know, lyrics and melodies and stuff.
Yeah.
And then when we got it all kind of to a certain place, they brought in Frank Filippetti to come engineer like the for real versions of everything.
Gotcha. That was gonna be my next question. Was like, so when you guys are tracking riffs, like, are you working with the guys getting guitar tones and setting up that stuff? Or are you running the rig? Like, what was that looking like?
So for me at that time, it was I did a lot of the let's call it off-site work.
Okay.
So like I would be at the studio a lot, but then a lot of the time Scott would be like, okay, we're gonna just sit here and record vocals for 4 hours. Why don't you go back to our studio and sift through and see if you can find some other riffs, or like, you know, just start kind of like helping us get along with the pre-production side of things.
Yeah.
And then once we started actually tracking, then my job shifted into, okay, let's get you to do all the editing stuff, like chopping drums and all that kind of stuff, or
Yeah.
sound replacing or adding samples or whatever. And then as we got closer to the end, Scott really started to allow me to add a lot of like loop stuff and like sound designy kind of things.
That's cool.
And that's kind of what my credit ended up being. I'm pretty sure my credit's like additional programming or something like that. Which I was just like, I just want my name on the record.
Yeah,
I
no
don't care what
kidding.
it says. Right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and it just like, and then Frank came in, and that was a whole other thing. Like that guy is like a godfather of recording. Right? And
That
like,
was going to be my next question.
yeah, and he just like he's the nicest guy, and he
Cigar,
just, like,
cigar in his
cigars
hand. Yeah.
every day. And he just had like a system where uh, I had worked with a few different LA engineers like on random one day sessions,
Yep.
and they were all really heavy handed, like lots of compression, lots of EQ and things like that.
Yeah.
And Frank was like kind of the opposite, where he would record everything raw, but somehow it sounded better than like it sounded finished, even though it was just like microphone to 1073 with no EQ.
Yeah.
Um, and that was wild. Like he just like the way he would do guitars and stuff. They had like 4 or 5 cabinets. I'm pretty sure they were all Mesa cabinets with V30s and stuff. There may have been a couple like variations.
Yeah.
And then he would set up mics on them. And usually, if I can remember correctly, it was like there'd be a 57, but then there would be like an Audio Technica 4047. It's like this
Silver one.
yeah, the silver one.
One of my favorite mics.
Yeah, and then he also was like, I think they were just coming out, or maybe he was demoing them, but he had those dual element Audio Technicas, the
Yeah.
one that's like a condenser, and he had one of those too.
Yeah.
But like he would do simple, like it seems simple now, but like at the time, like it blew my mind. Like he'd basically get them to set up all the rigs, and then they had like a radial JD7 type thing,
Yep.
which is like the guitar splitter, and they would feed a snare drum into it, and then he would record all the mics, and then he would look at like how far away they were from each other, and then he'd have the crew basically move all the microphones so they were all perfectly phase aligned with this.
He would run
snare.
a sound of a snare drum through it, so it had like a sharp transient.
Yeah, through all the amps, and then he would basically line up all the mics on all the cabinets so they were perfect.
Interesting.
So then when he would start doing his blending on the console, he'd have them all on the small faders on an SSL.
Yeah.
He'd start moving. Like there was never that, you know, like sometimes when you put up 2 mics and you pull a fader up and you're just like, this kind of sounds weird. I'm just gonna pull that one down.
Yeah, totally.
That didn't happen. It was just like, oh, now there's more low end. Oh, now it's brighter. Oh, now it's this.
Interesting.
And like, and he, I don't know, he just made it all look like way too easy.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, like, I always hear people talk about, like, that kind of group of people, like Al Schmidt and all those guys,
Yeah.
where people are just like, they just knew how to do stuff, and he was one of those guys, like, is one of those guys where it's just like,
Yeah.
he made it just look so easy, and, like, he was the nicest guy, and, like, but he was also still kind of like an engineer's engineer. Like, we had all these, Chandler TG2s, and he's like, "I think we should do a test and see if they're actually better than 1073s."
Mm.
So we spent, like, an entire day just, like, he recorded a bunch of stuff through them, and then we had someone else label them, and then he came back and he picked his favorites, and he's like, "Oh, when you know it, TG2s are actually pretty good. They seem to work a lot of the
Yep.
time."
Yeah.
Yeah, and, like, he just I don't know, he was just really good, and he had, Atticus had him running around doing a bunch of stuff too,
So
but
was
he was doing
he I think I know the answer to this. Because I've had I've been fortunate enough to work with some like old school engineers as well. And it's like me hearing you say that, I'm like, well, yeah, of course. I think anybody who got into engineering, like I feel like we were the last generation that had exposure to working with those guys. Anybody beyond us is probably kind of like, what? No EQ? Like, what did they do? So what was he spending a lot of time then? He was picking microphones that obviously had the EQ
Yeah.
curve he wanted. He was moving the microphones in positions that got him the quote unquote EQ curve that he wanted. By moving the mic this way, it's going to roll off the top end. By moving it this way, it's going to give you the mid bump. Even with kick drums, where the
Yeah.
bottom end is versus the attack is all placement and what mic you're using, right? Like that's kind of what
Yeah,
he
and
was doing.
yeah, and he had, like, other stuff too, like, he did Untouchables too, which is, like,
Yeah.
the sonically craziest record that band ever made.
Yeah.
But, like, I remember it pretty vividly, like, we were leaving, and I was talking because, like, Korn basically kept all their road crew around just to, like, help, and the drum tech was just like I was just like, "All right, man, I'll see you later," and he's like, "Okay, well, we're working with Frank for the next couple hours." I'm like, "What are you guys doing?" And they had basically put the drum kit on a riser on wheels, and Frank wanted to basically move it around the room
To hear where it sounded the best.
to see where it sounded the best, and
Yeah.
then he would put up room mics and then test, like so Frank, like, really, like, more than any other engineer I've ever seen, he really did his due diligence to, like, try and make it as good as possible.
Yeah.
And I'm sure he did use EQ and
Yeah. Of
compression, all
course.
that kind of
Of
stuff
course.
sometimes,
Yeah.
but I was kind of amazed, like, I really expected a guy like him to, like, dig in, and he didn't. Like, it was really this very flattering, natural, kind of, like, very malleable sound, I guess.
I think
And I
when you hear of people doing it that way, I think like our tendency, especially when we're talking about like rock records, you're just like it's not possible, and you're like, ah, less is more. No, that doesn't work. It's not that it was less is more. Is he was using different tools to kind of get. I
Yeah,
don't want to say the same result because it's not the same result, but like yeah, he was using the tools differently.
yeah.
Well, and it was also in a time. I mean, he also was the fact that like you're like I had him set him up on a drum riser, or we're spending 4 hours shooting out mic pre's. Like I mean that just doesn't happen anymore.
No.
It doesn't. And ultimately, there's also a lot of like almost like preconceived notions. It's like if you just went and spent $3,000 or $4,000 on a Manly Vox box, well, you're gonna want that thing to win every shootout it does.
Yeah,
Because you're
exactly.
like, oh shit, I just spent all this money, right? It's like he came from it. He's like, I don't care what sounds better. Like it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's like whatever sounds better sounds better. So yeah, that's interesting. And so did once the Korn record was done, did Frank mix that one, or who mixed
No,
that one?
Terry Date mixed it,
That's
actually.
what I thought.
Yeah, which was another cool thing for me because
Did
I
you get
was
to go
like
hang out with Terry?
yeah, like, and that was, like, I don't know if, like, I think Scott probably had better things for me to do, but I think he knew that Terry was
That
one of
was a
those
big deal.
guys, because like, White Pony and, like, Pantera records and,
Hmm.
like, all that, like,
Legend,
new metal stuff, right?
legend.
And so he was just like, "Yeah, I think we're gonna need you to have to go hang out with and just make sure everything goes okay with Terry."
Yeah.
I
Okay.
got to hang out yeah, basically, so it was like, I got to hang out with Terry Date at Henson for, like, at least 2 weeks, I think.
What was he in the mix room at Henson, or
Yeah,
was
like, I think it's Studio D, like how
yeah
it's, like, the horseshoe
yeah
shape, it's the one, like, all the way at the end.
yeah
Um, yeah, and, like, he, again, nicest guy and just kind of, like, did it and
Did you get to
Yeah.
pick his brain at all, or were you just like, I
I
just
did.
want to be in the room. I'm not going to say anything.
Like, it definitely took a couple days to, like, get to know him and talk a bit more and stuff like that, and I did
Yeah.
get to ask him some questions, and he eventually signed a white pony thing for me. I'm like, it was like,
Wow.
yeah, I was, like, super happy about that.
That's cool.
But, like, he kind of had a similar attitude to Filippetti, where
Yeah.
he's just like, "I don't know how to tell you this, but, like, I don't do anything crazy, like,
Yeah.
it's really simple."
Yeah.
And I was like, it was, like, right around this time where I'm like, maybe there's something to this whole thing of, like, it's not this big crazy secret that someone's not telling me. It's like, it's actually really simple if you have the right person, right instrument, right mic, right room, and it's not like, a bunch of fucking gear you need to make something sound cool, I guess. Um,
Do you think I mean, this is just more of kind of a conversational thing regarding just kind of modern day engineering and production. When you were watching Frank or Terry or even Ben for that matter, like, were they like trying to be like, oh, I got to get the snare to sound like that album, and I got to get the kick to sound like that
Never,
album, and we
no.
got to read the magazine to see what mic they used on that guitar because we want it to sound like that guitar? They were just taking what they had and making it sound as good as it could be for what it was, correct?
Yeah, and, like, Terry especially, um, they're like, aside from the sessions that I prepped for him, he did not really do any mix prep. He
Yeah.
basically showed up every day and he's like, "Okay, let's hear the song." And then he would listen to it once, and then he would say to the assistant at Henson, he's like, "Can you put my like, this kick and snare on this?" Like,
Yep.
1 sample, not a whole bunch.
Yep.
And then while the guy's doing samples, he would just start mixing the song, and then, 6 hours in or something like that, he'd probably either send out a ref or they came to us. I can't remember what it was, but Jonathan or the Matrix would come down and listen to it. They'd give him notes or comments, and then he would spend, 2 hours wrapping it up. And then usually the next morning, there would be a set of recalls. We'd print the finals, and then he'd be on to the next song. So it was like a day and a quarter per
Yeah.
song or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like he didn't really come in and like at least I don't remember him reffing anything either. I think he
Yeah.
just kind of came in and was just like, "This is the song. This is what the production is. This is what I'm getting out of it."
It wasn't.
And
It
that was
wasn't
basically
6
it.
hours of trying to match the rough mix.
No, and it wasn't. Yeah, he didn't have like Pro Q3 trying to EQ match with another song or any of that stuff. It was
Yeah.
just like he would just dial it in, and like
You,
I yeah, I don't know. I just found it really interesting by comparison to
I've
now.
yeah. I mean, and I think it proves again something I've witnessed, and it's we're just going so far the other direction as a kind of just like a not an industry, but just kind of as the production world. Um, because I think of the, like you said, the Pro Q3 EQ match, like, because that exists, and I'm not shitting on that particular tool because it's a tool and the tool's inanimate. It's who's using the tool, right? But I feel like there's a lot of times I'll get a mix and somebody will reference something. They'll be like, well, we really like this thing, but they didn't actually record it to sound like they just recorded drums, and they're like, cool, the drums don't sound like shit. They're like, well, did you like you're like the snare drum you're referencing sounds nothing like the snare drum you recorded, and the cymbals, the overheads are nothing like that. Like, it's more like people just record everything. Just, yes, I got it on into Pro Tools, and now it's kind of like, now go and make that match something else that I like. And that then prompts conversations about, like, man, how do you think they got that sound? And I say this all the time, and some of it I know if I know the guys and I've talked to them about it, and it echoes what you're talking about with Terry. They weren't trying to get that sound. That's the sound that they got. You know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah.
it wasn't like, I mean, yes, the White Pony snare, they were trying to get something in that vein, but they didn't have a recording of that snare that they were trying to match up to. They said, we want to get this kind of thing, and that's what they ended up with. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of the guys, a lot of people now think that like it's like it's almost like a treasure map where it's like, oh no, I see where the X on the map is. Now we got to figure out how to get there. And it's like, no, that's not what this is. These guys didn't have a map. They weren't following a map. They were like more of the fucking like explorers who were out in the ocean. They're like, we don't know if we're going to hit land, but once we get somewhere we like, I guess that's where we're going to stop. And it's like, so it's, yeah, it's such a strange, it's such a weird headspace that I think a lot of people are in now. And when I hear stories of that, it reminds me of like I said, very similar era type producers and engineers when you're just like, you know, how did you get that? Like, so did you guys, so like, what'd you do? Did you do this? And did you try this? And they're like, well, actually, no, we were trying to get a big kick drum sound. We didn't know what that meant. And we got to a point where we're like, that's cool. And then we stopped.
Yeah, I like to call it time travel producing. That's what a lot of people do now, where they try and like retroactively decide how a record's going to sound after they've done the part where
That's
you make
interesting.
those decisions.
Yeah.
Right. And I've had it happen. Like, I have vivid memories of doing sessions with people and like, you know, you drum day, you're like, do you like the sound of the drums? Or like, sounds amazing. And
Yeah.
then it comes to mix time and they're like, can we get like a lower tuned, deeper snare?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, I could put a one shot on it or something, but like that is not what we recorded.
Yeah.
And that decision needed to be made like at that time.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah,
I think that's then what leads to, well, why do we need a Pro Q3 with 45 bands of EQ? Well, because we're trying to take a bell brass and turn it into a fucking, you know, piccolo and with a big like boof on the bottom of it. And it's like, no. Because nobody really has that foresight. Whereas if, you know, again, sometimes you don't necessarily need to have that vision of like, oh, it's got to sound like this. You're just like, okay, we want this type of thing. And you just go until it's good. But then that's the decision you've made. You live with it and you move on. And I think that's why when you make records that way, when then the mixer gets it, he's like, well, I'm not actually doing a ton. And you're like, well, that's, yeah, of course, because 75% of those decisions have been made.
Yeah. It's totally true.
Yeah.
100%.
It's a very different way. And I don't know. I'm probably romanticizing, you know, the previous generation of music production and in engineering. But I mean, I remember when I went down to LA and I started working with Scott Humphrey, like he was very similar in that realm where we recorded it the way we wanted it to sound. And then all of the adjustments afterwards weren't stylistic like 180s. They were like, okay, well, now that the track is built up, that snare drum needs a little more body, but it wasn't like, well, let's turn that into a completely different sounding drum. It was like, we enhance it to get the thing we're missing, but it's still in the style of that we intended. Or same with amps. It's like the whole reamping craze with just like, you're like, oh, here's the DI. And you're like, well, what was the intention? What did you guys record this with? I guarantee you didn't cut the guitars with a DI. You're going, blink, 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 blink. You were listening to something. You probably instinctively tweaked something that you like to play with. Isn't that not kind of where but we really like the sound off of that album? Well, that's those guys. Like, stop trying to match stuff. And I think that's why stuff's a little like homogenized now, you know, is because everybody wants to just sound like something that already exists, as opposed to just being like, yeah, this is cool. Let's roll with this and see what happens.
Yeah, I think I've said this to a few people, but I think anybody who wants to get into production should go on the internet and look up the stems from the Guitar Hero and Rock Band games.
Okay.
Because like it is so bizarre to hear a song that you think sounds absolutely massive, and then you listen to the individual elements and you're like, wow, this is painfully average. This is not what I expected. But I think a big thing that people are missing now is like back then, and some people still do it this way, is you built a record layer by layer. You'd get the drums and the drums would be 99% finished.
Yeah.
and then you'd put guitar tones or a bass tone on top of that that worked with that thing. Not just like, let's get the biggest guitar sound we get. It's like, let's get a guitar sound that works. And then because they build it layer by layer, it all congeals into this really like glossy finished sound. Whereas now a lot of people are like, okay, so we recorded super bare bones drums. We'll put crazy samples on them. And then we're going to reamp all the guitars and all the bass to get the craziest tones.
Mm-hmm.
And then weirdly, none of this is fitting together and it sounds strange. Why is that? And then they try and like add more instead of just trying to build it from scratch.
And then they'll hire a mixer who mixed a song they like from a completely different band that was recorded completely different and say, can you make it sound like this?
Yeah. And I'm sure like some of those, like, especially in that, the Nail the Mix crew.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of those guys deal with stuff like that, where it's like, hey, we're a band from Idaho and we want to sound like this record you made.
Yeah.
That had 10 times the budget and a big producer, but we also don't play the same genre or the same tuning or anything, but we need it to sound the same. Can you make that happen?
Yeah.
And it's like, it just doesn't work that way ever.
No. And then ultimately I don't know if you ever really are happy with chasing that thing. Yeah. It's weird. A quick side note. I actually mixed quite a few songs for Guitar Hero and Rock Band.
Did you really?
Yeah. And there was another project that I was working on with Scott Humphrey and a couple other guys at the time that was kind of the next evolution of Guitar Hero that never really took off. But we licensed like 100 times the amount of songs that Guitar Hero did. So while we were developing the software, we were doing those types of, I call them mix recreations. Like we were doing mix, like, so I had like the craziest like multi-tracks that you can imagine, like some of the most classic shit ever. And, it was exactly what you said. Like that was one of the biggest mixing educations I ever got, was listening to, I mean, the stems from Guitar Hero. I mean, just for somebody just going and be like, yeah, I want to go access those are great. But the stems are what I did or what another mixer did, which might not even actually be accurate. Cause one of the, how I got into it was actually, it was strange. So me and Scott Humphrey and a couple other guys, we were doing this project that we were working on. Scott used to work with Bob Rock. Bob Rock came over to the studio and was like, "Oh, what are you guys working on?" And I think I was like doing a mix recreation of like, I don't know, a Foreigner song or something, but something that Bob was like a little bit into. And he was like, "Oh, this is fucking cool." And like we were, you could solo. I was like, I want to know what love is. And you hear the gospel singers like, "Oh, this is cool." So he's like, "Oh, wow." And so I think I don't know how deep of a demo we gave him, but ultimately it made an impression enough on him where at the time he was working with Offspring. Offspring just got like, I think 10 songs licensed for Guitar Hero. They just sent the tracks over to the video game company and they all sounded like shit. And so Bob recommended me to do all the Offspring mix recreations. And so they sent me a couple tracks and I did them and everybody liked them. And then that turned into that label. I ended up doing a ton of stuff for blah, 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 blah. But the multi-tracks, hearing the multi-tracks and how, like you said, how average some of the best sounding mixes, how average the multi-tracks in isolation were. And that doesn't mean that we added a shit ton of stuff to make them sound good. It was just, it was done with intention and purpose of what does this sound like within the context. And there wasn't some big, like I call it a creative 180. There wasn't a big creative 180 when they got to mix time. And I don't know. I'm not saying that's the reason things were good, or not. But I mean, it's definitely something that I feel like people don't think about enough, which is why I find this a very intriguing conversation because you had the same experience that I did, even though it was kind of a completely separate thing. So I've got a couple questions in the chat, if you don't mind, and if anybody's got any questions, jump in. Sorry, some of these were coming in as we were talking about other stuff. I've got one here that just popped up. If you had to choose, what do you think is the most marketable? sorry, the thing's cutting off. Skill for an engineer. What's the most, and let's say today, obviously, I think we both know what that marketable skill was in 2004, and ultimately it was that you weren't 40 with 3 kids, and you were
Yeah.
willing to work 100 hours a week. But like, let's go modern. Let's go like current day. What would you say is potentially like the most marketable skill for an engineer to have right now?
Well, I think it depends on the career path. Like if you are trying to work with someone who's already established, like you're trying to become their assistant or something to like get your foot in the door.
Yep.
I still have, and I've always thought this. I think being able to edit musically is like the biggest thing. If you can chop drums quickly and you can chop bass and vocal or tune vocals or do any of that kind of stuff, that's a job that someone like me or you doesn't have to do anymore. And that makes
Yeah.
such a huge difference. And but if you want to go like even more broad than that, like I think just generally understanding signal flow and like how studios work. Because I've definitely been to some studios in the last couple of years where I got the impression that maybe that like, and these are bigger studios where I didn't get the same kind of confidence out of assistants and stuff
Mm.
that maybe I did 10 years ago, where I'm just like, do they really understand how this room works, or have they just learned how people use it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They don't
And
understand how it works. They just follow the step by step, and the minute one little thing changes, they're lost because they don't
yeah,
understand the theory
'cause they
behind it.
don't
Or
they don't really know where anything goes, right?
yeah,
But yeah, I would say like, I don't know, just generally like editing's a big one. But I would say like, especially in this day and age, as things shift away from being kind of like the traditional studio stuff,
yeah.
um, I think just general musicality is like super important. Like
Hmm.
I wish like I have pretty decent music theory and I can, I can fumble around on a piano or a guitar or anything like that, but I wish I had more of that because
Interesting.
it's really turning into a thing where your engineer is starting to become like the track builder and like not necessarily co-producer, but you're definitely doing some arrangement stuff a lot of the time.
Yeah,
And like, I think it helps a lot just to like have some musical background in any capacity. And the reason why I say that is because I think a lot of people who want to do this don't have any of that.
yeah,
And that's really interesting to me because when I grew up, like that was like it was a no-brainer. You're a musician first, and then you kinda do this stuff, right?
yeah,
Um, and, not to keep just rambling here, but I think the other thing that's really important is, like, the ability to collaborate,
mm,
because I find a lot of people are laptop warriors now where they're very comfortable making music on their own in Ableton or Pro Tools or whatever, but you put them in a situation where they have to work with someone else, and they're just like, "I don't like not being able to tell everyone what to do."
yeah,
Like, I don't like when someone else doesn't like my idea and I have to now, like, defend it or whatever. So just being able to, like, collaborate with people, I think, is huge.
yeah. That's a very interesting point that I don't think a lot of people ever really think of. Um, I think they understand that they're going to be working in a room with other people, but I don't think they understand then how to morph their skill set, their technical skill set into that. I will say, like, and I agree with everything you said. I'll kind of just add a little point to that. That has kind of been my experience, and I'll tell you. And I've heard from people who work with you as well, who kind of echo this for you. Obviously, technically, you're great at what you do. I think the technicality, in my experience, especially today, because the way the tool sets are, it's been so democratized with the tool set, right? Like you can do a lot of technical stuff with your eyes. You don't actually have to use your ears anymore. And the tools are the interfaces are built so well. And so the workflow is so like, I don't want to say no brainer, but I remember when I started working with Scott Humphrey in the first Rob Zombie album we did, Auto-Tune doesn't track Rob Zombie,
No, of course it doesn't. No, never.
but we still needed to tune that record. And
Yeah.
I'm like, how? Like
Did you
how?
guys use a harmonizer or something like that? With the
Well,
dude?
no. I mean, luckily we were in Pro Tools, but that's how Scott used to tune vocals before, like back in the day. He would basically use a sampler. So he would load one syllable into the sampler, and he would be like, "That's flat." He would just use the pitch adjust on the sampler, go up 8 cents, and then be like, "Yeah, that sounds good, cool." And then you basically MIDI it back in and piece it all back together, which is essentially kind of what Melodyne does. But there was no interface for it. And so I remember the first time like doing the first Rob Zombie thing I did, like I was just using the pitch plugin, and I'd be like, that kind of sounds flat. And then I would pitch it up, and I'd be like, that sounds too sharp now. And I'd be like, okay, what did I go up? I went up 37 cents. Okay, now but what does 20 cents sound like? Okay, cool. That sounds good. Move on to the next syllable. Like that. When that's how you had to do it, you would get hired because you were the only guy who could do that. Well, now everybody can tune a vocal. Now the guy sweeping the floors or the guy, parking the cars, he probably can tune the vocals as good as I can. Like, so that's like, we're all on the same playing field now. And ultimately, my long-winded way of saying is like, I feel like the technical skill is almost status quo. Like, I feel like that's not what separates anybody. I feel like, for the most part, again, I'm talking in big averages, big generalizations, but I'm saying once you get into a certain you've reached a certain threshold of like proficiency, it's not like, oh, but he's really good at crossfading, like no, like no, like that, no. Ultimately, I think what it comes down to, and I don't know if this is marketable, so maybe this is a dumb answer to this, but I think ultimately it really comes down to like work ethic, reliability, dependability, and ultimately, I think there's something to be said for just an overall vibe's not the right word, but like, like when you're a kid growing up, or even when you're an adult, you can get into a room with 20 people and it's like, you're a nice guy, you're a respectful person, you're going to get along with everybody, but there's probably going to be 3 or 4 guys in the room that you just click with, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we were talking about like back in the Matrix days and I said, yeah, it's not quite like that anymore. Like, I feel like everybody's got their team. And I think because people have realized like all the good songwriters are really fucking good songwriters, and all the good engineers are really good engineers, and all the good mixers are really good fucking mixers, and all the good guitar players are really good guitar players. So do you know what you do? You find the guys you click with, and you're like, I know you can do just about anything I need you to do. I like you. You hear music. We have similar instincts, or maybe you have a complementary instinct that I don't, and that's why I need you. And I think it's finding people to click with. That's not the answer anybody wants from this Q&A, because that's not something you can go put on. You can't go put on your website. I click with people like that,
Yeah.
But I think if you really want to, I say, find some sort of success, long-term success, I think being aware of like, how do you fit in? Find your clientele, find the group of people that you fit in with best, as opposed to, trying to force yourself into a situation or try to browbeat somebody with your awesome technical ability of being able to, phase a line, bass guitar or something. Like, nobody cares. I don't want to say nobody cares, but I feel like we can all kind of do that now.
Yeah.
To a certain extent. Anyways, long-winded answer.
No, I completely agree with that. I think I say this to people pretty frequently. I know engineers that are way, way, way better than me who don't get the gigs I do because I'm the king of the hang. Right? Like
I love that.
like that's kind of like, and I'm sure, if you ask Chad or Ian or any of those guys, that's how that stuff happens, is like, you're maybe not necessarily fun to be around, but you're not annoying to be around. And that's the biggest thing, is like, especially when you're in a studio and you have to be around somebody for 12, 14 hours a day. It's like, you have to like that person, or it's going to be the worst day of your life.
I've often said, like, 20-year-old Chris Baseford, 20-year-old Chris Baseford wanted everybody to want to work with him because of how awesome everything sounded. Like, that's all I wanted. I'm like, I just want you to hire me because you love my work. And then like 40-year-old Chris Baseford realized that like probably 10% of my gigs were because of that. And the other 90% was like, well, you know what? Like he's reliable. He reliably can and consistently and dependably get us what we need. And then it took me, it was a little bit of a mind fuck for a second, being like, fuck, am I any good? Do they just like me because I show up on time? And then and then literally probably 2 or 3 years ago, like I had a little bit of an epiphany and be like, what would you rather? Would you rather somebody be like, I want that guy because he's a good dude, or I want that guy, he might be a little bit of a dick, but I want him because his mixes sound really good. I mean, I think at the end, when I'm probably 80-year-old Chris would probably prefer the previous 60 years of my life being spent with people who thought I was a good guy or thought or valued me because of some good quality, like personal quality traits, as opposed to like how I could EQ a kick drum. Right?
Yeah, 100%. And like, I don't know if it's just like the world we live in now or whatever, but like, and I'm sure I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but I'm sure you've met some people in I'm sure you've met some people in the industry where you're just like, this person's a piece of shit.
Never.
And I find like
not in the music industry.
Oh, I have.
I'm kidding.
Many.
I'm kidding.
So many. But I find it happens way, way less now. And I think it's because people have realized like, hey, we can make these records with people that are nice, and we don't have to hire these people that are jerks just because they're good.
Yes.
Like, right? Because like you said, skill level is starting to balance out pretty evenly.
The tool set leveled the playing field.
Yeah. And then like soft skills, like how you deal with people, become way more important, like way more important.
100%. Unfortunately, like I said, that's not that doesn't answer your question at all, because that's not marketable. But I think hopefully that was a more useful answer than just what you could put on a website. I got a couple more questions here.
Sure.
And thank you for that question. That was actually a really good question. You know what? Enrico's got a really interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought about this. Well, I'm sure I've thought about this, but I don't know if I have a good answer for this. Was there anything you learned back when you were interning running that you feel can't be learned online or hasn't been covered online? Aside from just let's see if we can come up with something other than just like the experience. Let's say like there's a certain amount, like you can read about how to hit a baseball, but until you go to a batting cage, you're probably not going to be able to do it. So aside from that, is there something that you're like, you got to be in the fire if you're going to figure that out, aside from just being there?
Like, maybe this isn't the answer they want, but I think for me, the biggest thing I learned was like the studio etiquette side of it.
Yeah.
Like when someone sends you out for food and stuff, you don't just like get them their food and then like just bring it to them. Like, especially at Ben's place, it was like you get their food, you get them a plate, you get them a knife and fork, you get them a napkin, you set it all up in the lounge, and then you wait by the door until Ben or Chuck or somebody saw you. They'll wave you in, and then you just say like, "Hey, buddy, your food's here.
Yep.
I put your credit card and the receipt next to the food." And then they know where it is and all that kind of stuff. And it's like such a small detail, but it's like I always thought of it as like a hotel.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's like,
you worked in the hotel, right? That's how you bought your first setup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my dad was a general manager of a big hotel. So like that whole environment was something I grew up around, where
customer service.
That way. Yeah. And just like the little details, right? Like if you notice that the client is eating the blueberry muffins every morning, get those ones every morning. Get more of them.
When you're throwing out the banana nut muffins every day. Yeah.
Like and I think that's one, like it's noticing the small details and adapting, I think is the biggest thing. And like anyone who's been a runner will tell you, there are a litany of different kinds of clients, and some of them are really easy to work with and some of them are really hard. But the hard ones get a lot easier if you know their patterns and you can adapt and, whatever. And just generally like knowing people's routines too. Like, Jonathan Davis, he had a guy named Jim Monty, nickname was Bud, who was like, I think he was like his day-to-day guy, and he was
Yep.
also like an engineer. He's an engineer as well. He works with like Metallica and stuff now.
Wow.
But like Bud had Jonathan's daily schedule like down to the thing where he's just like, oh, it's this time. Jonathan's going to ask for his tea in like 20 minutes. So I'm just going to go get that ready right now.
Yeah.
And then it was just like, it's one of those things where it's like you start to like, people will rely on you more if you can predict what they want, basically, I think.
So the short answer for that is mind reading.
Yes, exactly. Get really good at mind reading.
No, I agree. I agree with you 100%. I think I mean if I was to summarize that, it's almost a I mean it's a customer service that I don't know if you can absolutely. I think you can. I think you can learn that quote unquote remotely. Like I say, like I had this conversation recently about just my mix business and how I conduct recalls and file delivery and all this stuff. And I'm people who watch this will probably be like, you're full of shit. You are absolutely rigid. But with my clients, I'm actually not nearly as rigid as I am in the rest of my life, because ultimately there's a level of customer service there that I am like, yes, as much as they need me to help them get to where they're going. Ultimately, they're my client. I have to accommodate. Like I'm there to serve them, for lack of a better term. And so there's a customer service element that, like you said, it's like you learn that real fast when you're a runner, or you learn that real fast even when you're now the engineer. If you're tracking, and I know we've already been talking for a little bit. We haven't even got to the thing that I want to know the most about, which is the Big Wreck album. We'll get there in a second. But like ultimately, it's like when I was tracking for other producers, the philosophy and the concept's the same. If you know that producer is about to ask you, be like, okay, let's get another track. Let's put that on another track. Or you know that they're about to ask you to add a little bit of reverb to the vocal that you're recording because they want to hear it a little more in context. You anticipate that, so that way when they ask for it, it takes 5 seconds instead of 45 seconds because you weren't paying attention and you weren't really taking what you were doing as a customer service role really seriously. So when you are, when you're a runner, you're there to support the studio. You're there to support the engineer, the staff, the artist, right? And so you need to be attentive to them. You need to cater to them, for, again, lack of a better term, but it's the truth. Well, then when you get to assistant engineer, well, now you're doing the same stuff for the engineer. And then when you get to be an engineer, you're doing the same stuff for the producer. And then when you get to do the producer, you're doing the same stuff for the artist and the record company. And when you're mixing, you're doing the same thing for the producer and maybe the artist and maybe the manager who's like really involved in the mix recalls and maybe the A&R guy. We're in a service based, it's all service based.
Yeah.
And so it's customer service. And I don't know if you can learn that online. You can't learn that online, but I also don't think you have to like go slug it out in a commercial studio, which isn't really an option for a lot of people anymore, unfortunately. I think there's ways to learn that, like you said, go work at a hotel, go work at a restaurant, go work at some sort of really heavily customer service based, where if the only reason people are there is because of the service, and you'll learn those skills that will translate really fast, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's huge. Like I was at the warehouse in Vancouver, warehouse studios in Vancouver, like a month ago.
Great place.
Great place. Theo, the assistant there, was like the best assistant I've ever had. And it's because he was like, fucking on it.
Yeah.
And it's like, but then you talk to him and it's like, yeah, I work with Bob Rock like all the time. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense why you're like this then.
Yeah.
Because you're working with like one of the biggest producers out there.
Well, and he's he's seen it all and he went through it all. And if you can't cut it with him, what's the warehouse's business? Well, the warehouse's business is also customer service, and you are an extension of them. So if you can't cut it, you're gone.
Yeah.
They're not going to lose Bob Rock coming in. You're going to have to go. So I don't think we need to beat that horse anymore. I think that's kind of what it comes down to. If I was to summarize kind of what you were saying as well, Yeah. Somebody said here, work at Guitar Center. You'll learn customer service real fast.
Yeah. Lawn Equator Guitar
Wow.
Center.
Yeah. Yeah. Restaurant work should. Oh, hey, Paul. Paul DeCarly in the house, everybody. Paul's going to be on. Paul's hopefully going to be on. I'm going to pressure him to be on here. I'm going to give him some peer pressure here.
You should go on, Paul.
Yeah,
It's
Paul's
fun.
awesome. Restaurant work experience should be prerequisite for any serious career. You know what? I had this conversation last night. I was out for dinner with a friend, and I said I was listening to a podcast, and somebody, I can't remember what country they were from, but they were just talking about like modern society and blah 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 blah. They're saying, yeah, I think we should. I think pretty much every country should have some sort of mandatory service. And it doesn't necessarily have to be military. Like it could be public service. It could be like whatever, but there should be some sort of mandatory, like when you're 18, from 18 to 20, you got to do this. And there's no benefit except to the community and to society and to your country or your city or your town or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I think if you had to do that, I think that would make people better people just in general. And you would build in some empathy and some compassion real fast.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So,
And I'm sure you're the same way, but like I have definitely, when I was a runner and when I was an assistant, I had people yell at me and I didn't like it very much. And I
yeah.
make a point to not yell at anybody even when they colossally fuck up,
Yep.
because I know that does not help at all.
Nope.
And like it's like you said, like once you've been through it and you've been on the other side of that thing, it's a lot easier to have a little bit of compassion for people. Um, and it's, you understand too that it's not actually the end of the world, even if it feels like it is at that exact moment, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, 100%. Let me go through the questions here. We'll get one more question, and then it's all me. I'm asking questions because I want to know. Okay. Sorry, I'm picking and choosing questions here, just kind of trying to stick to a little bit of kind of what I think Chris will really be able to give some cool answers to. So somebody said the unwritten intern runner etiquette and rules will help you in any career for the rest of your life. 100%. And I feel like I kind of learned my studio etiquette from other jobs. Like, so when I got to the studio, I'd already kind of had that built in from other jobs. So yeah, it is what it is. Okay. Some of these are kind of, I'd say, redundant questions. Some of the technical stuff. All right. Let's move on. Okay. So chronologically, let's go back. Okay. So go to LA. You're working with just massive bands, engineers, producers that you were fans of that like were some of your biggest influences. At what point were you like, okay, I'm out? Like LA's not for me anymore, or like what led to you moving back to Canada? What was kind of the impetus of that
catalyst?
Yeah.
So it was like things of the Matrix were great. Like it was, I think at this point, let's say this would have been like 2007. So I'd been there for about 4 years or something. And we had just gotten into a routine. They were letting me do like engineering for the drum sessions and stuff, and like I kind of felt like I was at the point I wanted to be at with them, where I was doing more and I was still having to do the food runs and all that, but I didn't mind because I was getting to do like the other jobs. But like, I'm not going to say that they were having like a downturn, but they definitely were slowing down a little bit.
Yeah.
I think they all got a little tired of the schedule. And Scott kind of pulled me aside one day and he was just like, we're winding down a little bit. You will always have a job, but I just want you to know that like the music stuff is kind of taking a back seat to a bunch of personal things we all want to do.
Yeah.
And like, just like having kids
Families,
or
yep.
family stuff or whatever.
Yep.
So I didn't really like initially, I didn't really have an exit strategy. I wasn't thinking about leaving. I wasn't doing anything. And then it was around like, I think it was like August or September of that year. I kind of just got this itch to like do something else. And I had some friends that were like, "Hey, can you come up to Vancouver and record our stupid little demo?" And I was like, "Okay." And I was like, "You know what? I'm going to Vancouver anyways." And I'm like, I was I wouldn't say I was burned out, but it had been 80 or 90 hours a week minimum for 4 years, 6 days a week. I didn't really take vacations. Like I took a few, but
Yeah.
nothing too much. And I think I was just kind of ready for like a change.
Yep.
So I think it was about November or December of 2008. Was that what it was? Yeah, it would have been 2008, not 2007. I just, quit and gave them like 3 months notice or something like that.
Yep.
And we wound that all down. And then I moved to Vancouver, moved in with some friends of mine, recorded their little metal record thing. And then I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I kind of started having this like 25-year-old midlife crisis thing where I'm like, do I want to like keep making records or do I want to like go back to school or whatever?
Yeah.
And I kind of put out my resume like real half-assed to a few of the studios in town. Didn't hear anything back, and I was like, I think I was trying to like give myself an out
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
But then one day I got a call, and it was this guy Bruce Levins, who was like the manager at Greenhouse, which was one of the studios in Vancouver.
Yep.
Kind of like a B tier studio below like where the warehouse would be, but it's still like they had the two
Good
SSL
place.
rooms.
Yeah.
Brian Howes was in one of the rooms. Like it was, and he basically, like he said, he saw my resume. He brought me in for an interview. We kind of talked a bit, and then he's like, "Can you assist on a session?" And then I showed up to the session, and there was already an assistant there, which was kind of strange. And then there was this guy Doug, who was like the producer, and Bruce was just like Bruce is kind of a character, we'll say.
Okay.
And he basically was just like, "Oh no, no, no." He's like, "Doug, I'm giving you 2 assistants for today." And Doug was like, "Okay." So basically what happened is I tried to stay out of the other guy's way a little bit, but it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that he didn't really know the room.
Mm.
And it was my first time in the room, but I had used SSLs a ton.
Yeah.
So like there was this moment where he was trying to patch something in and it wasn't working, and I could see Doug was getting mad, and I just kind of walked over and grabbed like one of the TT cables and just moved it.
Yeah.
And then Doug was just like, "Hey, can you run Pro Tools?" And I'm like, "Yep." And then it was just like instantaneously like that. And again, it was small things. So he's doing a drum session.
Yeah.
We finished the last song. I know he's gonna wanna record drum samples, so I
Yep.
load up a Pro Tool session, and he's like, "Hey, so we're gonna do this thing," and I'm like, "Drum samples?" He's like, yeah."
Yeah.
And I'm like, I hit record, I'm like,
We're
"Let's
ready
do
to
it."
rock. Yeah.
So Doug told Bruce, he's like, "Yeah, that guy's good.
Yeah.
That guy's really good." And then Bruce basically was like, "Do you wanna be the in-house assistant engineer? We don't really have staff, so it's like
Yeah.
you would assist or engineer every project that comes in."
Yep.
And I was like, "Okay. I guess that's what I'm doing." And then the other assistant kind of became my runner or my assistant, which was kind of weird because he'd been there for quite a while, I
Yeah.
think.
That's a strange dynamic.
Yeah, and he ended up leaving like probably like I don't know a year later or less, but that's kind of what my first getting into the Vancouver scene was. And then almost immediately after I started there, they put me on this record for this band called the Veer Union. With this producer named Greg Archilla he's from Nashville or something.
Okay.
But it was like they were on Motown or something like that. And it was like, like a $500,000 budget record. Like it wasn't
Wow.
some small thing. It was big.
Yeah.
Even for that time, that seemed like a lot of money.
Yeah.
Did that for 3 months. And then in that time period, I met people like our mutual friend Jeff Johnson.
Yep. Awesome.
And you probably know Gordini too, I
Yep.
assume.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like and I started to meet all these people in Vancouver, and then it just kind of turned into this thing where I would assist for Jeff and Gordini. And then when Gordini kind of moved on to some other things, or like he wasn't always available for Jeff, I
Yep.
started engineering for Jeff. And then it just started to kind of build again, just like it did in LA. And then
Yeah.
me and Jeff did some stuff with Faber Drive, which did pretty well. And then I started engineering some other stuff. I met Steve Bays from Hot Hot Heat, started doing some stuff with him. And I stayed there for probably, I think it was like 5 or 6 years. And I loved it. I didn't really want to leave, but my project started to shift to being a lot of mixing.
Yeah.
And for a while there, I really wanted to be a mixer. I don't as much anymore, but at the time I did.
That's what we all want, right? When you're engineering,
Yeah.
when you're tracking and then you hand over the session to a mixer, you're like, why can't I finish this? And then when you end up just mixing all the time, you're just like, oh God, can I get back? Can we go track some drums?
So basically what happened was I kind of told the guys at Greenhouse, I'm like, I'll do the bigger sessions.
Yeah.
I'm like, but all the day-to-day weird small indie band stuff, I'm like, you can give that to someone else.
Yeah.
I started mixing more and more, and then at the time, this seems silly now, but I was like, Kelowna is way cheaper than Vancouver, and I'm working from home.
Yeah.
So why don't we move to Kelowna, where my family was at the time,
Yep.
and me and my wife were just like, yeah, let's do it. So quit Greenhouse, moved to Kelowna, And then I basically just started working in a bedroom mixing records for like a while. And that kind of became a little draining. And I kind of moved on to some other things and things like that. But I kept all those connections in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is I would just keep traveling back to Vancouver to do records all the time. Um, and and that's like, like I said, like me and Jeff and things like that. And then Jeff Johnson moved into the general area as well. Like he
Yep.
lives
That's
out
right.
out in
Cold
whatever it
Stream.
is, Vernon,
Yeah,
Coldstream. I
Cold
always
Stream.
forget what it's called. Yeah.
Yep. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jeff.
So,
We just
anyways,
told everybody where you lived.
yeah, yeah. So fast forward to like, what would this have been? 2019 or 2020. I'd been in Kelowna for like 7 or 8 years doing stuff. And then like like this is the story that I think just absolutely kills me because I know you want to get to Big Wreck.
No, we got all the time. I've got all
Yeah,
night.
yeah. But I'm laying in my kid's bed looking up at the ceiling, just trying to get him to go to sleep, and he's telling me about school or something like that.
Yep.
When my phone buzzes and I look at it and it's this text message, and the text message basically says like, "Hey, this is Chad Kruger from Nickelback. I got your number from Jeff Johnson. Do you want to come to my house and help me do some recording stuff with I don't even think he actually said who the artist was."
Yeah.
And I looked at that, I'm like, this kind of sounds like bullshit, to be honest. Like instantly I was like, but he called me Hollywood in the text message and he said Jeff. So I instantly texted Jeff and I'm like, all right, is this like
who is
Gordini?
this guy?
Yeah, Gordini fucking with me or something? Or
Yeah,
like what's
yeah.
going on? And then Jeff immediately, like 2 seconds later, he called me and he's like, no, it's Chad. You have to call him back right now. He's like, his normal guy's out of town or whatever. And he's like, he needs somebody. And I'm like, okay. He's like, but don't call him, text him. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So I just text back and I said to him, I was just like, hey, I have to be honest, I had to call Jeff because I didn't think this was actually real. And then I was like, I would love to come down. I don't know what it is. And then and that's when he said, it's like, yeah, we're gonna do some stuff with Ian Thornley. And I was
Yeah.
like, holy shit, okay. And I was like, okay, so what do we like? What happens here? And he's just like, well, these are the dates. And can you come? And I'm like, yeah. And then he's like, okay, I'll see you then. And that was it. Like, and this was like maybe a month before. And I kind of called Jeff back. I'm like, am I just supposed to show up at this guy's house now? Like, how does this work? Like, and he's
Yeah.
like, yeah, like that's all he wants you to do is just go there. So sure enough, he calls me maybe 24 hours before I'm supposed to be there, and he gives me the gate code and all that stuff.
No.
And then like, there's still this part of me the whole time.
You're
where
like,
I'm just
where am I staying?
Yeah.
Like, how long? What's
Yeah.
happening? Do I need to bring anything? Yeah, this is.
And I still didn't feel like it was real. And
Yeah.
then, we drive down there, we go to the house, the gate key works, gate opens up, and that's when I think that was the moment where I'm like, this is actually happening.
This
now.
is real.
And then my dad was dropping me off because he was like going to Vancouver anyways, or my parents were, sorry. And
Yeah.
and we pull up to the house and there's Chad standing outside talking to like a delivery person. And I'm like, this is like actually happening now. And then we get out of the car, we do his introductions. Chad's as charming as he always is.
Yep.
And then he's got this giant wooden box next to his front door and he just kind of laughs. He's like, yeah, that's my new slushy machine. We're going to put it in the bar downstairs. And then like my parents leave, me and Chad are just kind of talking and stuff. And then it basically just turned into what it's like hanging out with Chad, where he's just like, let's go ride Vespas, and then let's go play pool, and then let's go do this and this. And we start doing all these activities. And then finally, after like 3 or 4 hours, Ian and Dave from Big Rex show up, and then the mood changes, and then we're like into work mode all of a sudden.
Yep.
So I guess the goal was they wanted to like demo or just co-write together. And I think the idea was to try and get 2 song ideas out of it.
Yep.
And I was put into the position of basically being the guy on tools, and then everyone else does whatever they do. And the first couple days were really stressful for me, like super stressful. I'm like, I didn't know if I was doing well or anything.
You mean they didn't pat you on the back every time you did something good?
No,
that doesn't happen.
No, and I think it was actually, to be fair, I think it was actually the first night.
Yeah.
When everything was winding down, Chad just like very casually was just like, you are really fast at this. This is going good. And I was like, okay, now I can relax a little bit.
Yeah.
And not be just an absolute stress case the whole time.
Yeah.
And then we spent like 3 or 4 days kind of like working on these songs, and we were doing like, 14 or 16-hour days where usually, Chad would be there for about 12, 13 hours, and then maybe Ian would want to stick around for an hour or two just to do some noodly guitar stuff or whatever.
Yep.
Um, and then we got to day 4 and Chad was kind of like, "Well, I think we're ahead of schedule now. We need to like take a day." And we're like, "Okay." And he had this like pontoon boat on his property and he's like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, we should take the boat out."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Yeah, cool, let's do it." And then I didn't realize that wasn't the boat he was talking about. He was talking about his yacht,
He's talking about the big boat.
the big boat.
Yeah.
So like we drive to the marina and stuff, and I'm just like, "Oh, this is a boat that has floors and bedrooms and stuff on
Oh
it. This is
yeah.
bizarre."
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, like, my wife calls it the Rockstar Summer Camp because it was, like, everything you would imagine a rock star to be in this very, very short window of time, like 5 days.
Yeah.
Like, we did the like, all of his little toys, like the four-wheelers and Vespas and all that kinda stuff. We went in his pool, he ordered us food every night. He had, Brad Kine come in and cook us steaks,
Yeah.
best steaks I've ever had in my life to this day.
Yeah. I know, right?
And it was just like this really, like, basically everything I wanted it to be. And then at the end of that, I think the part that really was nice is, me and Ian really started to get along, like, and this goes back to what we were saying, like, I think the building of the relationships is more important, and I kinda said to him, I'm like, "Hey, if you guys like, when you guys go to finish these songs, I'd love to help out or whatever."
Yeah.
And he was just like, "Cool, man. Yeah, that's great." So, they ended up finishing them with somebody in Toronto, which was fine.
Yep.
And then they came to, Kelowna maybe, well, I guess because of COVID, it probably would have been like a year later, year and a half.
Yeah.
I went to see them play, and then I kind of, like, reestablished that connection and said, like, "Hey, just to let you know, like, I'd love to work with you guys again." And Ian kinda said, he's like, "Well, like, it's hard for us to get out here and all that kinda stuff." And I was
Yeah.
just like, I can travel to Toronto, like, it's easy for me to go, not you and all your stuff."
Yeah.
And I didn't really think anything of it past that point. I was just like, it's like that whole planting seeds thing. You just hope that something happens, but you don't really ever know.
Yeah.
And then it fast forward to like, I think it was, what would it have been, like February or January of last year. I got a call from Dave, their manager, and he was just like, "Do you want to come and engineer a bunch of songs for Big Rec?" And my first question was, "Where's Eric Ratz?" Because he's done everything they've done
Yep.
for the last, like, whatever, and they're
Yep.
like, "Well, Eric's not available. He can mix it, but he can't make it work with his schedule."
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know who it is. It's like Oprah or something like that. They have this quote where they're basically saying that, like, opportunity is a combination of luck and preparedness,
Yep.
and I think that's kinda what it is. It was just like, Eric's not available, Ian needs someone else.
Yep.
I just happen to be top of mind,
Yep.
and then it just all kind of fell into place. So I tentatively agreed. We tentatively had dates.
Yep.
He didn't really tell me anything else. He didn't tell us like what we were doing, where we would be doing it, or anything. And then we
Typical.
fast forward, yeah, typical. Fast forward a couple months, and then he's just like, "Yeah, so we're gonna get you to come up to Toronto. It'll be about 3 weeks or something like that."
Yeah.
And then the producer's Nick Raskulinecz, and I was like, "Excuse me?" I'm like,
How cool is
and
that?
for people who don't know, Nick is like probably one of the bigger rock producers out there right now.
Yeah.
Um,
And has been for the last like probably
20
15,
years
20
at
years.
least.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Like he's done all those Foo Fighters records and the Deftones records and a million
Tons.
other things,
Tons. Yeah.
tons of stuff.
Yeah.
And he's just like, "Yeah, he's like, the only wrinkle right now is Nick doesn't know you, so he wants to do like a phone call." And I was like, "Okay, cool." So I arranged this call with Nick. We talked for a bit on the phone, and I think Nick was just kind of feeling me out. He's like, "Okay, so you
Yeah.
worked in LA, you know some people."
Yeah.
And he even told me, he's like, he didn't say this, but you could kind of tell. He's just like, Ian wants you there, which is basically like Ian's already decided you're doing the record, and I
Yeah.
just need to make sure that that's not going to be a colossal problem,
Yeah.
right? And but I think I think I at least got him on my side enough to say yes,
So
at
hey,
least
but
from that.
let me ask a question.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, obviously as little or as much detail as you want, but like, how does that conversation go? How was he feeling you out? Was he asking like technical shit? Was he just kind of talking like
No,
conversationally? Like, tell
he
me a little
I
bit
think
about like what you're up to. Like what did that conversation look like or
yeah,
sound
like
like?
he kind of asked some general questions like, "What have you been working on?" and all that kind of stuff, and
Yep.
and I was, like, really transparent with him. I'm like, "I did some light pre-mix stuff for the last Nickelback record." And I was like, and I did these 2 songs with Big Rec
Yep.
with Chad a couple years earlier. Like
Yep.
I didn't try and make myself sound more than I am or anything like that.
Yep.
And then his questions kind of diverted away from that, and it was more about like, how do you feel about Ian, and like, do you feel like he respects your opinion, and like, are you able to stand up to Ian if you have to, and things like that.
Yeah.
And I just kind of like, again, I was just honest. I'm like, look, I've worked with Ian for a total of 5 days, and I thought it went really well. It obviously went well from Ian's side because he's asking you to talk to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like Ian would at least respond to criticism or a comment if I had to be in the position to make that.
Yeah.
I'm like, but I also feel like me and Ian's aesthetic ideas kind of align as well. And then he just kind of asked me some general questions about like working, kind of like what was it like working for Ben and
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff. And then we talked about Randy Staub for 20 minutes, just complete like offshoot.
Yep.
And then he was just like, okay, well, he's like, Dave will let you know what's happening, but he's like, I think it's gonna be a go. And then it kind of turned into just like, what studio should we go to?
Yeah.
And and I said, well, I'm pretty sure Ian's already made that decision for both of us. I think we're going to Noble because that's where they do all of their stuff.
Yeah.
And then he was like, okay, have you ever worked there? I'm like, nope. And he's like, neither have I. He's like, neither have I. And so, but I looked at the gear list and I'm like, they have 18 Neves. They had like 10 1084s and 10 1073s. They
Yep.
had an SSL. They had all the mics, and it's Ian's worked there a bunch. I'm like, it's obviously like one of the nicer studios in Toronto. And then yeah, logistical stuff happens. I fly there, get there first day, and I can't remember who it was, Arkells or Bare Naked Ladies or somebody. Bare Naked Ladies, I think they were just moving out of the room and they were like a day behind. So we went into another room, did a bunch of like demo stuff,
Yep.
and then the real day started on day 2, and that's kind of when things escalated into like, okay, we're doing a fucking record now. Let's
Yeah.
everybody like, let's get to work kind of thing. And it's like, I know Ian's posted a lot of pictures about this stuff, so it's not anything too crazy, but like they rented like 5 or 6 drum kits and like 30 snares, and like Ian and Nick both are very particular about sound, so they would spend a lot of time
Yeah.
like
Very much. Yeah.
this snare with for this song and these hi-hats or this ride for this song, and
Yep.
like, and it was kind of nice to see like that what I always assumed was actual production, where it's just like they're
Decision
choosing
making.
they're
Yeah.
making decisions on the spot of
Yeah.
like what needs to happen. But it was a really weird thing for me because I even said this to Nick, I think. I'm like, I feel kind of weird being here because you're probably like an infinitely better engineer than I am.
Well, yeah. So
And
he was an engineer at Sound City
yeah,
for quite a while, and that's kind of one of the things I was going to ask you about. Not to interrupt, but like Nick's a very, very capable engineer. So I was curious, like how did that dynamic work? Was he relieved that he could actually be like, I don't have to worry to make sure like the kick drum's not fucking clipping. I can listen to the song because I got somebody who can take care of that.
well, and that's kind of like in a roundabout way. That's kind of what he said to me. He's
Yeah.
just like, no, he's like, I don't want to do that shit. He's like, I'm here for the songs. Like
Yeah.
he's like, if you're doing something I don't like, I'm going to tell you real
Yep.
quick.
Yep.
But
Yep.
and Nick had like he's a fantastic producer. He just every so often he'd come up and he would just say something like, "Can we change this? Can we do this?" Or he would, allude to an idea like, "Oh, I sometimes do this," and like I just took that as like, "We should just try this right now." Right? Like the guy
Yeah.
knows what he's doing,
Yeah.
so I would just kind of do it, and like for the most part, he kind of left me alone to do my own thing, and like Ian would be a little more um hands-on with sounds.
Yeah.
So Ian was very
With
much
with
there
li-
kind
with
of
drum
drive.
sounds as well, like
Yeah, oh
everything.
yeah, with everything.
Yeah.
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 I swear Ian has the whole record in his head before you even start.
Yeah. I
Right?
always kind of got that vibe, just hearing about like the previous records and just kind of his work, the way he works. I always kind
Yeah.
of assumed that.
Yeah, but it was an interesting dynamic because I think Nick is like I think he's a bona fide real producer,
Yeah.
which is actually really rare in this day and age where he would just sit back and he would just be listening and listening. And then whenever he would say something, it was always something very critical. And he would not critical like negative, I mean critical like important.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and his opinion was always something that generally made the song better,
Yeah.
right? So you wouldn't hear anything from him for like, 3 or 4 takes, and then all of a sudden he'd be like, "Oh, you know what? Can we just try this? Can you try, instead of doing that on the bass, can you play this little thing? Or like, can you make those eighth notes instead of sixteenths?" Or like, and all like I think pretty much every comment he made was like completely valid
Yeah.
and made the song better.
Yeah.
Like he just had that natural knack for what music should sound like, and what did a pretty good job at like shaping things and kind of being someone that Ian could bounce ideas off of and all that kind of stuff without being too like heavy-handed with it.
Yep.
Like I've met some producers that are very like, we're doing this my way
Yeah.
and that's the way it is.
Yeah.
And Nick is not like that at all. He's very much like, let's all work together to kind of get this the way it is. But if I think there's a problem, we'll discuss it very quickly,
Yeah.
right?
We'll hash that out in a constructive way, in a collaborative way. Not to get too like into the nitty gritty technical stuff, but so you mentioned you're probably the tracking was what, 4 weeks you said ish?
Yeah, I forget what it was. I think it was I want to say it was either 15 or 17 days. Yeah, something like that. So I think with my travel days, it was like 20 or 21 days
And
in
did you
total.
did you guys obviously got drums going? Does everybody typically play together for beds? Do they kind of just whatever works for whatever song? Sometimes drums, sometimes guitars.
Well, Ian had, and I mean this literally, Ian had what I would call near release ready demos.
Yeah.
Where he had already recorded vocals, he had already added vocal effects and delays. He had obviously he had tons of guitar ideas and things like that.
Yep.
And then he programmed drum parts and stuff too.
Yep.
Or I maybe I shouldn't assume he did, but I think he did.
Somehow there
And
was drums on it. Yep.
somehow there was drums on it, and Dave had played bass on some of it already.
Yep.
So what we basically had was finished songs,
Yeah.
and then we just removed a piece and we would record it. So we
Yep.
started with drums.
Yep.
I can't remember how many days of drums we did. It was
How
I
many
wanna say
how many days just getting sounds? Like what do you when you're doing it that way, when you've got 5 kits and 30 snares, what's the setup like? Like did you guys spend like 3-4 days kind of mapping things out?
No.
No. You
No,
jump
it
right
was,
in.
it actually reminded me a lot of The Matrix. It was very breakneck pace, um, but there was, like I said, there was a lot of thought put into the kit choices,
Yeah.
but for any one song, I would say maybe they would spend 2 to 3 hours doing that at the most.
Yeah.
Like, some songs were even faster where Ian was just like, this particular kick I've used since the first record,
I
this
like it.
snare,
Yeah.
and you just go in and you just know it's gonna work. But even the miking and stuff, like I had a setup in mind when I got there just based on what I normally do
Yep.
and some things that I knew that Rats did that Ian would want. I literally like I went on Rats's and the Big Wreck Instagram and I just like basically scraped as much information as I could get and
Yeah.
from as many pictures as I could.
Yeah.
And I kind of noticed some patterns where I'm like, okay, these are probably some things that they want.
So you did some homework.
I did some homework,
Yeah.
100% I did.
Smart.
And then the setup time, like maybe it was longer than I think it was, but it felt like it was like I had 5 or 6 hours to get everything in and
Wow.
like
That
and ready to go.
that's not a lot of
And
time.
no, and like Nick was in there too, and Nick was just like, he made, like I said, he's a really good producer, so he's just like, I really like using a PZM on the kick, and I
Yeah.
was like, okay, I never do that, but we're gonna do it right now, and
Yep.
just like,
Yep.
and it was kind of this thing where I'm running around doing stuff, and Ian and all that, we're kind of just sitting there, and then I remember I pushed up one of my I wouldn't call it a trick, but one of my favorite things for drums is if a studio has an AKG C24, which is like the stereo
Yep.
C12,
Yep.
is put that in the back of the room and it usually sounds good.
Yeah.
And I remember I pushed those faders up, and then first thing Ian had said to me pretty much all day was just like, "Oh, those sound like drums now." And I was like, "Okay, so now we're like actually getting somewhere." And I think like
Because he
that first
likes a more of a natural kind of big,
yes,
roomy in the room sound.
yes.
Yeah.
And like I would say I can't speak to other records they've done, but based on what they sound like to me, it's like a big part of it is the room sound. That's what
Very
he's
much.
after.
Very
Like
much.
he's in like we had a lot of talks about this. Like he's really into like Phil Collins, like Abacab and things like that,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Where it's like big roomy drums. And then that was kind of the thing. It's like once I got the room mics up, now Ian's in I wouldn't say interested, that's the wrong word, but now Ian's like, okay, so now it's my turn to start making suggestions.
Yeah.
And
He's
Ian's got
engaged.
some, yeah, he's engaged a little more.
Yeah.
He comes in, we start doing some tweaks. You know, hey, can you make the kick drum less bright? Can you do this, that? And then Nick comes in with his comments. And I wouldn't say I felt rushed, but there was definitely this lingering feeling of like we can't make these guys wait too long,
Mm.
right? Which I kind of I'm used to that. That's kind
Yeah.
of what every project I've ever been on was. And then once we kind of had the setup, um, it didn't change that much song to song. I may tweak an EQ here or there, or Nick may suggest something and we would change it.
Yep.
But for the most part, the mics and stuff didn't really change, and it was more about the pieces on the kit.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you,
and
and by all means, I mean, trade secrets are trade secrets. Would you mind to share kind of what kind of just a basic setup was for that?
yeah, so on most of the songs, the setup, like let's start with the drum kit. Drum
Yeah.
kit was usually obviously single kick drum, snare, and then there would usually be 3 to 5 toms.
Okay.
Sometimes they were concert toms, sometimes they were regular toms. It all kind of depended on the song.
Yep.
So a lot of the setup is pretty standard stuff. Like we'd have like a 421 and then the PZM on the inside of the kick. I'd have like a Neumann FET 47 on the outside.
Yep.
And I don't use them much, but Nick wanted to have the sub mic on them too.
Yep.
Um, so we had that, and then snare was 57s. I didn't really move away from that much.
Yeah.
Noble has 7 U87s, all vintage ones.
Wow.
And one of the things I noticed from Ratz's pictures is he always used those 87s on all the toms. So I was just like, I said to the assistant, I'm like, "Can we do 87s on toms?" And he literally said back to me, he's like, "Yeah, like Rats does? Okay." And just went and set them all up. And
Yeah.
it seems so absurd because I've like the only picture I've ever seen with someone with that many 87s is like there's a picture from a Michael Jackson session.
Yeah.
But I was just like, they have them, so we'll use them.
Yeah.
So then Ride was probably like KM84 or something.
Yeah.
I used an SM7 on the hi-hat. Um, and then overheads was I want to say they were U67s or something like that. Some large diaphragm.
Large diaphragm. Yep.
lemons.
Yep.
And then the room stuff, there's a couple like tricks I don't want to necessarily give away, but
Yep.
my stuff that I added was the C24 in the back.
Yep.
And then I always put up a couple of mics that truthfully are usually garbage. So like I put them up just to see what happens. So I had like a ribbon mic mono in the front.
Yep.
I had another ribbon kind of like inside the kit area, like
Yep.
it was kind of over the kick drum. And then I think for a couple songs we put just because we had it and it seemed ridiculous to not use it. We had a U47. So I was just like, just go put it up in that corner over there. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Something.
and honestly, the C24 was the only thing of those bits that we ever ended up using. Like
Interesting.
Yeah. And then Ian's weird stuff that he's got going on. I
Yep.
shouldn't say weird.
Yeah.
got
Yeah.
some
He's
stuff
got his
too.
particular kind of setup that he's
Yeah.
found that works. And yeah.
Yeah. And then the only thing that would really change is like if the kick drum had a front head or not,
Yep.
if the head was ported or not, like things like that,
Yep.
where the mics may get reduced or added. And then the toms, I think after a while, Nick was kind of like, I don't think he was, he wasn't forceful with it or anything, but I think he was kind of like, why don't we just use like 421s? Like, why are we overcomplicating this with these big, bulky
You can't fit them
things?
anywhere. If somebody
Yeah.
hits them, they're gonna destroy
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
especially with the concert toms, he's just like the sound of those things is a 421 in the bottom.
Yeah.
That's the sound.
Yeah.
And I think it took Nick saying that to kind of make it okay to try that.
Yep.
Because I think, especially with Ian, like if he sees Rats use the 87s every time, it's probably, Rats makes them sound really good.
Yep.
So that may have changed, but for the most part, the mics stayed the same. And it was just like, I think the hardest job for the runner and the assistant was every song. It was like, okay, pull the kick drum out. The PZM they had was like really large. It was like a gold colored one.
Oh,
So
weird.
it never fit through the port.
Yeah.
So they had to take the front head off every time. take the mics out, put the head back on, grab the next one, and
Oh,
then
pain in the butt.
you put the kick drum up, and then Ian or Nick would just be like, "Nope, let's try another one," and then they'd have to like do it all again for the next one, and like, and all that kind of stuff. But day 1.5 or day 2, it just became
This is what we
the
do.
routine.
Yeah.
This is what we do.
Yeah.
And Sekou, the drummer, was great. He,
Yeah.
he was
Great
doing
drummer.
3 to 5 songs a day kind of thing. Like he was really driving it home. And like Nick and Ian would almost comp on the spot. And then um, we would package those up and they would go off to Nick's guy to just be like, whatever his drum prep would be.
Yep.
Um, so I think the initial idea was over the 15 days, we were going to get drums and bass done. That's all they wanted to get done in that
That was the
time.
goal. Yep.
That was the goal. And then we finished drums within like 5 or 6 days or whatever it was. And then like Dave is probably the best bass player I know.
Amazing bass player.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
silly good.
Yeah.
And we kind of like, we were sitting with Ian and I'm just like, we're gonna finish bass like real fast. Like, 3 or 4 days, maybe 5 days at the most. That's still gonna give us 5 or 6 days. What do you want to do? And I think there was this moment where it was just like, well, do we really want to start guitars or should we do that some other time or whatever?
Yeah.
And then Dave did the whole record or the whole batch of songs in like, I think it was 2.5 days. Like he just,
Just
the guy just practices and practices and
Yeah.
practices, sits down and just goes for it.
Yeah, nails it.
And like, I kind of expected to have to work harder on bass tones. I figured like, once you get into that nitty-gritty stuff, especially when it's like anything with strings on it, I kind of assumed that Ian and the crew would get a little more particular.
Yeah.
But we kind of had like Dave had a pedal set up and like a DI set up and some sort of amp. Honestly, I can't even remember what it was. And then like a bass cab. And I just kind of pushed all the faders up and I'm like, okay, what do you want to do? And there was a lot of times where Dave's just like, I don't know. I think it sounds fine the way it is.
Sounds
Let's just
good.
do it. And then we just tracked and tracked and tracked. And then basically, yeah, 2.5 days later, whatever, 3 days, maybe all the bass is done. And then it's like, okay, Ian, we got to like, it's fucking guitar time now. And that's like the thing I was looking forward to the most. And he's like, okay. So then the truck rolls in.
Yeah, hang on. I'm gonna stop you. I got one question because we're gonna get the guitar stuff. I just want to ask you a question about the bass because it made me think of an experience I had that I'll mention afterwards. So bass kind of you just put everything on. You're like, well, sounds good. Like what? I don't know. What do we need to do? What do you attribute that to? Did he just like? I mean, obviously he's a great player. Does he just have his gear dialed? Is it just he'll make anything sound good? What do you kind of attribute that to?
Well, I don't know, but I think part of it is Dave does have his sound absolutely dialed. And like he very much was like, I'm using this for this song, I'm using this for this song. And like he had his pedal or like arrangements and all that stuff down. But I also think the way we tracked it helped, where basically we had the super clean DI. We had another DI that was basically like post pedal board.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was off the back of his amp. I can't, but it wasn't through a cab. I know that.
Yep.
And then we had 2 mics on the bass cab. We had like I think it was a 421 or maybe it was the FET 47. And then I used the sub mic too.
Yeah.
Which is something I saw Filippetti do, and I basically have done ever since.
Yeah.
And it was kind of this
trick.
thing where Dave would just be like, it just kind of needs a bit more sub, and I would just like push that one fader up. Okay.
Yeah. And
that's it, right? But I also was like, and in retrospect, I kind of wish I was a little more heavy-handed with the way I process things. But I knew that Rats was going to mix it, so I wanted to leave him a little room on the tracking, like nothing too crazy, but like I didn't want to go too heavy-handed, and then he's just like, I need to reamp this. I would rather him kind of, if he needs it brighter, he can make it brighter, or he's got these DIs, he can add a sand.
Did you left everything split out so he had control over it?
Basically left basically everything for the session was always split, like except for guitars
you committed down. Yeah.
But bass, it was like I left them the 4 tracks and just so they had a bit of that control and stuff like that. And then basically Ian's guys brought in his stuff.
So the truck shows up
Yeah, the 2-ton white cube van or whatever.
He's like, you
Um,
thought we had a lot of drums. Wait till
yeah.
we start guitars.
Well, and that's the thing, like, he brought, it's Ian, so he brought, I don't know how, like, and I'm not exaggerating here, I think he had, like, 30 to 50 guitars,
Yeah.
and, he did an Instagram video, so I feel like I'm okay to say this. He brought, like, 7 or 8 heads, like, 4 Sir heads, he had
Yep.
the custom audio, he had the EVH, and then he brought a couple of combos and things like that,
Yep.
and then I can't remember cabinets, I think they were definitely Sir cabinets, but I think, there was 2 different speaker types, can't really remember. I'm sure one of them was a V30, can't remember what the second one was,
Yeah.
um, and then, like, it became this whole thing where it's like, okay, now I'm in now I'm in Ian's dojo, and he's about to show me, like, how to do stuff,
Yeah.
and it, like, again, kinda like with the drum thing, it kinda became a little stressful for the first 5 or 6 hours because it's like, this is Ian Thornley, if he doesn't like your guitar tones, you're gonna know about it pretty quick.
Yeah.
So what we basically did is I had a bunch of mics on the cab, like, 57s, 421s, and I think we put up SM7s too because Nick wanted
I
to.
love
Um,
SM7s on guitar
and
cabinets.
and I like it a lot now. I'm
Yeah.
definitely gonna do it way more.
Yeah.
And, I just had all those on line inputs, like, we'd go through 1073s, the line inputs on the SSL,
Yep.
and then I, like, mix to a bus, and that bus would go to some Sauce or right to Pro Tools.
Yeah.
Um, and it was, like, amazing to watch because Ian would just be like, we'd pull up a song, and he would be like, "Oh, like, I think this song, like, this part needs this kinda tone," and then he would basically decide which amps and all that stuff, and we had, like, a JD7, so he could just toggle them,
Yep.
and there was always, like, I one of my biggest complaints about almost all modern studios is none of them are set up for guitars anymore.
No.
And it's really annoying because, like, we spent a lot of time with fucking power and, like,
Yep.
things humming and shit and, like, cables not reaching and whatever, but, like, once we got it settled and in,
Yeah.
he would pick a tone, then we would spend anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour getting the sound, and then he would fucking 1 or 2 take every part, like, the tracking part of it was not in the equation, it was the sounds, and it was just wild to watch
Well,
him.
as an engineer, um, I mean, I don't know if it gets any better because I'll tell you what I hate. I hate like when you go do, I don't know, pick a, it doesn't even matter what a band is. You're going to do a heavy rock band and you're like, okay, cool. Plug in the rectifier 57 on like, the edge of the dust cap and straight in, and you're like, yeah, cool, sounds good. And then you spend the next 6 hours recording the rhythm part for the chorus of one
Ugh,
song. And you're
you
like,
give me
fuck my life. Just kill me now. And that's not fun. That's not
no.
fun for anybody. So what is like, you just described what I would consider to be actually like the dream like just scenario for an engineer tracking guitars, where you're like, yeah, you know what? We're going to tweak sounds for this one part or for this one song. And 9 minutes later, we get to do it again.
Yeah.
As
Yeah,
opposed to 5 hours later of tune your guitar again, please. Tune.
Yeah.
You missed again. It's like, like that's awesome. That sounds
Yeah.
incredible.
What you're describing is giving me flashbacks. I've done it so many times, like, and, like, doing the whole thing of, like, having them fret the chord and then you're tuning
Yeah.
for
Oh
them, and
God.
they don't move, and then all they gotta do is play that one chord, but they pull one of their finger, like,
Oh yeah, I know.
there's none of that stuff, right? Like, the guy just knows, like, I don't even think he remembers this.
Yeah.
I definitely remember it because it was fucking nuts. We were tracking a song, and he had some old guitar, like a Les Paul or some, I don't know, some guitar, it didn't
Yeah.
matter. And it was the one guitar that we were having, like, mild tuning issues with.
There's always
Like,
if there's only one, you're goddamn lucky.
Yeah.
There's usually one that stays in tune.
And Ian's like, he's tuning, and then he's playing the part, and he's just like, "No, this isn't working." And then he started to kinda get a little irritated, and you could tell he was just kinda getting annoyed, and then finally he's just like, "You know what? Fuck it, just roll the song." And this guy
Bent it.
he would use his fingers to bend the chords in tune, and he just spent maybe 10 seconds just practicing it once, and then
Yeah.
he played it,
Yeah.
and I'm like, "Who the fuck can do that?" Like, that is
Yeah.
absolutely nuts. It blew my mind, and I bet he doesn't even remember. Like, it
Yeah.
was just, like, that quick. He was just like, "I'm just gonna fucking play it,"
Yeah.
and he just did it.
Yeah. He's like, yeah, ring finger, just shorten it a little bit. And
Yeah.
you're like, what? I know. It's
Yeah.
he's incredible. And you know, there aren't a lot of guys out there who can do that kind of thing and who like he's a real player. I mean, I don't even know how to describe him. I mean, he's so incredible. It was interesting when I first went to LA. I remember you've probably played this game when you're working with a band, and it's usually not the first day or two, but at some point, what did we call it? We used to have a name for it, where you basically pass around the auxiliary cord. And you're just like, oh, dude, have you heard of, and you plug it in, and somebody plays a song, and then you're like, oh, dude, pass me the chord, and you plug it in. And it's like 4 hours later, you and the band or the producer, whoever, we've all been hanging out, and you're all playing, like, you're playing stuff for other people, which is actually something that I've started to try to do at the beginning of working with a band, so I can kind of be like, oh, you like that. Oh, you like that. Oh, this thing I played you that I really like, you don't like. Okay, cool. Note, I like it. Kind of like calibrates people's tastes. But I remember going when I went down to LA, and this is 2002 or 3. Probably like the first 3 bands I worked with that you kind of get a little bit of rapport, and then you start kind of being like, oh man, here's this band that I love, and you're like, I've never heard of them, and I would just not even realizing that I was still kind of naive in the sense that I'm like, there's bands that are huge in Canada that nobody's ever heard of in the States. Like I didn't even realize that was a thing. I thought everybody in the world knew Big Wreck and the Tea Party and fucking Headstones and and I'm like, I had no idea. Like oh, I've never heard of these guys, or I Mother Earth or whatever, and they've never heard of these guys. And I remember I made a point. It was almost like every person I came into contact with in the States that we would start playing music for each other, I would make a point of playing Big Wreck. And I had 3 or 4 songs that and people would just be like, what is this? This is incredible. And the voice, the guitar, the drum tones, everything, I mean, they're incredible. That was I mean, yeah, you already know this. You've seen it firsthand. Okay, so you're tracking with Ian. He's just nailing every part. You get to play with he's kind of picking. He already know. Again, he's got his shit dialed. He's not plugging in amps and he's like, I don't know what this thing sounds like. He knows exactly what the thing sounds like.
Yeah, and we there was times where we would try something and it didn't work.
Of course,
and then, we tried something else. But
yeah,
for the most part, he already knew exactly what he was gonna do. He really was dialed in.
yeah,
And then the days got really long. We would start at about 10, and I think most days we were ending around midnight or something. Sometimes later.
that's a long
And
day.
yeah, and Dex, the assistant, was just like, "You guys work longer than anyone else. Why are you doing this?" kind of thing. He's like, "I haven't seen someone do these kind of hours in a while." But me and Ian would just get in the zone, and I think even though there really wasn't a time crunch, I think we both felt a time crunch because if we didn't get all the rhythms done,
You'd have to come back.
then something would have to there'd be some fuckery to finish the record, right?
Yeah.
So we worked really hard, and Ian started bugging me because I was yawning all the time because I was jet lagged.
Yeah.
I was sleeping in a hotel by the airport, and
Yeah.
then I
Yeah.
was doing this. And you know what it's like when you're sitting in the chair at Pro Tools, I don't care how much coffee you have, you're not staying awake very easily. Even if guitars are blaring in your face, you still get tired.
Yep.
So he would push me a little bit, I'd push him a little bit to do stuff, but it really became great. And there was this one moment that I basically blacked out from, where just very casually out of nowhere, he's just like, this might be my favorite guitar tone I've ever gotten. And I in my head, I was just like, what? And I don't remember what happened after that. I just blacked out.
Wow.
couldn't even tell you what song it was or anything. But like and that was kind of the moment where I'm like, okay, this must be going good. Like you wouldn't say something like that.
Yeah, no kidding.
But we just like we kept working, we got all the rhythms done, and um it just I think it like solidified our friendship or whatever. Like, because when you're just it's just you and another person in the studio, like you have to talk to each other, you have to like take lunch breaks at the same time and all that kind of stuff. So you spend a lot of time together and like
You do, and I've experienced that same thing. It's a cool thing. It's a cool thing when you're. I mean, I refer to it as the trenches, but by no means are these awesome recording studios with awesome gear, and it's not the trenches, but it kind of sometimes feels like you're in battle together, and there's a camaraderie that you get with these people that you're working with sometimes. And again, talking about clicking.
yeah.
And it's like, it goes back to that question that was kind of, just a kind of an off topic question. It's like, yeah, no, it's that's a special thing when you find those people you click with.
Oh, 100%. And I think like especially with Ian, I think we both have a love for the 80s.
Oh
And I
yeah.
think that helped a lot. There's a song on the Pages EP, like the first set of songs that have been released. I think it's called, I was just looking it up to make sure I got the name right. It's called Bird of Paradise. And it's like this total 80s tune. And it was like one of the first ones he played me, like first day in the studio. And like all I could imagine was kids at like a track and field meet in the 80s, like getting off the bus and seeing the other school. And I said that to him and he just started laughing. That's the quote of the album right there. Like day one, that's the one. And I think like things like that, like when you click with somebody, just those things kind of like they really help to solidify it. And like there's another song on there. I just want to make sure I get these names right here. Yes, Summerlong, where he really wanted that Abacab gated drum sound as an
Yeah.
example. And he wanted to do it for real.
Yeah.
But this is not a slight against Noble. It's an old console, but Noble's SSL had some, let's just call them minor technical problems.
Yeah.
Where you couldn't, I didn't feel confident in any one channel strip working completely.
Yikes.
So when you're trying to do gated drums, it became really tricky where I would turn the gate on and then on one channel, and then I'd go to do like the left side or the right side of a stereo pair.
Yeah.
And I'd hit the button and it would just cut the whole channel. And I'm just like, oh fuck. So now I got to do
fuck.
like, so we had this whole thing where like, I think me and Ian we ended up not doing it live. But we tracked everything big and roomy, and then we basically went into tools and did some trickery to get like things to open and close how he wanted and stuff like that. And I think that's like why Ian likes working with me, is because he can kind of just like say like, hey, we need to do this, and then I can tool it up or do whatever to kind of get it to that point. And now it's like one of my favorite tracks on the record because it's just this like weird gated real drum thing.
Dude, I gotta get you. I gotta get you the Arcus plugin.
Yeah, well, I have it. I've been using that actually.
That probably would have come in helpful with something like that.
Yeah, yeah, all that like that ADSR stuff.
Yeah,
like shape it like that. Like
yeah, or tempo map all the gates to open and close on the beats and stuff.
Yeah.
That and I think you said something earlier, about aesthetics, and it's like as you were talking, like. Obviously, it's like you're telling stories. Again, we have such parallels, and like you talking about working with Ian and a lot of this stuff. I'm like you substitute me and Chad, and it's kind of like this. It's like the same thing. It's like we have had so many of those moments, and you're just kind of on the same wavelength, and you want music to sound, you want tones to sound a certain way, and it's not like I have been on sessions where. I'm like, oh yeah, that's like we kind of want it to sound like this, and I'm just like, I don't know how to get that because I don't know when it's good or not because to me that never sounds good. So when you find people who are when they say I want it to sound, I don't know, you don't need sometimes they don't even need to tell you. You're like, I know what part this is, I know how I want it to sound, and if I make it the way I want it to sound. 90 98% of the time, it's going to line up with what you want as well. It's not like you're like having to be coaxed into doing something that's not your natural instinct. And when you find that, it's like a flow in the studio where you're like, cool, like this is fun. It's not that it's easy all the time. It's challenging because even getting it to where you like the sound of it is sometimes still a challenge. But you know that if you can get it there, that person is most likely going to align with that just because of the fact that you're on the same wavelength, right? You have the same aesthetic.
Yeah, completely. Like, and that's a huge like, and I think to a degree, like working with Chad and Ian at Chad's house, like that kind of solidified this because there's a song we did called
I love it. I know the one you're
Oughta
talking about.
Be.
I
Yeah,
love that. That is that is actually one of my favorite Big Wreck songs, by the way.
really.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
interesting story. I think maybe like that week, Chad sent me that. And he's like, dude, check out this track that he sent me both songs you guys did.
Yeah.
And just was like, she's like, what do you think? And the one the other one was good too, but I'm like, I was just like blown away. And that was let's say, quote unquote, the demo. I mean, that was,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I thought that sounded really great, and obviously the one that they ended up doing after, like the album or EP version, that one sounded good too. But what you guys did, I was blown away, and I'm like, this is so cool. Yeah, really cool.
Yeah, I think like I don't know exactly what happened after I was done with those two songs, but I think Dave was saying they basically just tracked real drums and then had somebody mix it. So I think most of the guitar stuff stayed and all that. But like that, like both of those songs, I think it was a big thing with Ian where like in the 80s one ought to be or whatever, he really was like, I just want these giant fucking tom fills. And then I was just like, I know exactly how to do that shit.
Yes.
And like we went into Superior Drummer and I just like cut the rooms
Yep.
exactly to size and stuff like that. And then like, I remember I think it was like day 2 or day 3. We finished it kind of like early in the morning before Chad got there because they all got up at like 6 a.m. every day because they were on Toronto time.
Yeah.
And we played it, and Chad came in, and Ian was just like, "Hey, Chad, listen to this," and he plays it for him, and Chad's just like, "Guys, that sounds amazing, but the toms are like 10 dB too loud." Because we both just kept turning them up louder and louder and louder because we just wanted to hear them.
Yeah.
And there's like this one part in the song where there's like an actual tom break, and he's just like, "Just juice them up there, like just crank it."
Yeah.
And he's just like, "Yeah, it's cool, just other people want to listen to the song, not just you guys, right?"
Just dial it back just a little bit. Well, like I said, I remember hearing that and just being like, damn, like that is cool. That was an awesome song. And that's a perfect example. Like if he was trying to do that with somebody who just kind of was like, oh man, I really love like not to say this like not in a bad way. I like the Black Keys, but if you were trying to, if your aesthetic was like those kind of like muted, kind of thuddy, kind of vintagey sounding, like thuddy dry drums, if that was your aesthetic, and he's like, I want to do this big Phil Collins gated reverb thing, that probably would have been difficult for you.
100%.
Right.
And like even with the drum techs, like Matt, the drum tech from YC, who was also amazing.
Yeah.
He even said to us, he's like, "Man, do you know how nice it is to come on a drum session where I'm not like taping the drums closed?"
Yeah.
Basically, like
Yeah.
where he's like, "This is the first session I've been on in like 2 years where the drums are wide open."
Yeah.
Like wide open. And I'm like, "Yeah, because he wants room tone. Like he wants big ambient singing drums. He doesn't want, they've done tight drums before,
Yep.
but this record is big."
Yeah.
That's what he wants, right? So
you guys got the guitars done, and they incredible experience, obviously.
Yeah, it was wild. It's one of those things I'm going to remember forever. Like it was just silly. And like, I'm not a guitar nerd kind of guy at all, but even me sometimes, like I don't want to give it away, but there's a song that hopefully comes out at some point.
Okay.
Where he does some absolutely ludicrous soloing stuff, or lead stuff. I maybe more accurately.
Yeah.
And I remember just sitting there watching him do it, and he's just like, he's just noodle, like he's having fun.
I know.
And to me, it's like this absolutely insane, whatever guitar stuff. And I just remember thinking, I'm like, can't even imagine how many guitar players would be like shitting their pants watching this. And to me, it was like a Wednesday.
Yes,
Like at that point, right? You kind of start to take it for granted a little bit. And then every so often he does something
totally.
just incredible. And you're just like, oh fuck.
You're like, oh yeah, this is what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
How much? I've got a few more questions, and then we've got a couple questions in the chat that we'll get to. How, like, when you guys were tracking guitars, it sounded like long days. He knew what amps he wanted. The parts, because the demos were pretty much flushed out. It was a matter of just kind of putting on the, kind of doing it for real
Yep.
or whatever. How much was Nick there, kind of digging in with you guys, or would he kind of like, okay, cool, you guys are good. I'm gonna go get some sleep and
Yeah.
come back.
So Nick's schedule, I don't know the exact details, but Nick's schedule actually got a little weird, I think, because it initially was supposed to be sooner and then it ended up having to be later.
Yeah,
So I think Nick ended up having to go back to Nashville. I want to say like day one of guitars. Like he was not there for a lot of the guitar stuff,
gotcha.
but we just like kept him in the loop. Like
Yep,
we would just send him a demo,
yep.
and like most of the time he's just like, cool. That was like
Well,
all
I
he
mean, Ian,
even.
Ian. I mean, at that point, Ian. I mean, like when it comes to the guitar stuff, and like I've kind of seen this and heard about it. It's like, yeah, he knows what he wants.
Yeah.
He's figured
I
it
think,
out. Like that's
yeah.
something he's not the, he's not the, like the, I don't even know why I say 25-year-old. Doesn't matter how old they are. He's not the, like, the kid in the band who doesn't know how to play his guitar, who needs me or you to tell him to tune his guitar. Like that's the complete opposite of Ian Thornley. Like
Yeah.
he's doing his thing. We're just there to, you're just there to kind of facilitate
Yeah.
and make sure everything goes the way he needs it.
Yeah, exactly.
Customer
Nick,
service.
and Nick, like I said, Nick is like why I think I respect him so much is he was there for the songs.
Yeah.
Like he very much could look at everything big picture and not get sucked up in tiny little details like that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that was a real big thing for me. Like I already respected him. I respected him even more when I worked with him. And he's really, really good at like cutting tension in the room. You
Mm.
know what happens on sessions
Oh
where
yeah.
like things go wrong or people get pissed off, and Nick just had this innate ability to say something just absolutely absurd and hilarious and just like change the vibe in the room in a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
Like he's from, I think he's from Tennessee or something. Like I think that's where he's born.
Yep. Yep.
And he can put on this like super southern accent and just everything he says is hilarious, right?
Yeah.
And he just knew, like, because like everyone gets frustrated sometimes, or like, a part's not going the way you want, and people start to get a little down. And he was really good at kind of balancing being helpful and like talking to the person like a producer, and then knowing that they're just in their head and they need to get out of it. So I'm going to say something fucking ridiculous and
Yeah.
everyone's going to laugh. And like he was just really good at like managing the room, I think is what I would call it. Like he was very, very, very good at that. Probably the best I've ever seen.
Well, and
Actually.
again, that kind of goes back to like the definition of a producer has gotten so
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know what the description. Diluted's not the right word. Murky's not the right word. Like it's become very yeah. It's like a producer's not just a guy who just goes and like lays down a bunch of tracks. That's not what a producer is.
Yeah.
And so like what you're telling me right now is very much, I think, how a lot of the guys that we kind of look up to and a lot of the like the legends that is like the true meaning of a producer. So it's really cool to hear like that was the experience. That's awesome.
Yeah, and like, to bring it up again, like our buddy Jeff Johnson.
Yep.
Like to me, Jeff is a real producer because
Yes.
Jeff can sit in a room, someone sings a line, and instantaneously he's like, "Hey, sing this. Here's the harmony for it."
Yeah.
He just knows.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And I think a lot of producers nowadays, and I think this is a certain amount due to YouTube, thinks that producing is a very technical job.
Yeah.
Like you're there to record things properly, but it's not. You're actually in like the people managing business.
Yeah.
And like getting the like extracting talent. You're a performance coach more than anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like trying to get the best out of somebody and put the best people together and all that kind of stuff. And it's like the reason why Nick is so successful, I think, is because he's I'm sure Nick watched the biggest producers of all time when he was
He
at, like,
did. Yeah.
at Sound City and all
Yeah,
that
for
kind of
sure he
stuff,
did.
right? And, like, I know he's worked with Garth. He told me stories about working with Garth, and I know he's worked with all these people, and then, like, the guy's been making records for 30 years and or whatever it's been, and you just kinda learn to read people, and you know when someone can be pushed and when someone needs to be left alone, and when to, like, when it's okay to poke the bear and when it's the end of the day if you do,
Yeah.
right? And it's like he was just absolutely flawless in that regard,
Very
from my
cool.
perspective at least, yeah.
Well, the album turned out awesome, and I know we've got people from all over the world tuning in tonight. And for anybody who watches after the fact, if you guys aren't familiar with Big Wreck, you should be, and definitely go check out the latest album and listen to, like, just sonically. I mean, it sounds incredible. So, I mean, obviously Eric Ratz ended up mixing it. Was kind
Yep.
of, it's been part of that crew for a while, and that's
Yeah.
a kind of a piece of that machinery. Did you mentioned, like, all the tracks kind of went to Nick's guy. He kind of probably prepped
Yep.
everything and got it, and then sent it to Eric. Eric mixed it, and
Yeah, like, there wasn't, to be totally honest, there wasn't a lot of editing,
yeah, I wouldn't
like,
imagine so.
even by a typical rock record, I think usually has a certain degree of slice and dice,
Yeah, a little bit.
and there wasn't really a ton of that, but yeah, basically, Nick's guy, who I feel really bad that I can't remember his name right now, he did a phenomenal job at just doing some basic, like, mix prep and stuff,
Yeah,
and then when the tracking ended, um, I kinda just went home and they all kind of finished vocals and stuff, and Ian had some truly tragic technical errors, with his computer, like, basically, it was kind of funny because when before Nick left, Nick said to me, he's like, "This is the one thing I need you to do." He's like, "I need you to get Ian to bring his computer to the studio. I need you to
back it
make
up.
sure it's gonna be good and all that kind of stuff." And it came down to, like, the last day or the second to last day in the studio, and I said to Ian in front of Dave, his manager, and Dave, the bass player, I
Yeah.
was like, "Nick is gonna fucking kill me if you don't bring your computer down here." And Ian just straight up was like, "I'm not bringing my computer." He's like, "It'll be fine. Don't worry about it." And I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "Dave and Dave, you heard him say that. It's not me, it's him."
Yeah.
So then, I go home, and then I get a call from, Ian maybe a week later, and he was just having some problems with playback because the sessions were all at 96K.
Yeah.
So, so we got him a hard drive, and then he had some issues with, like, licensing or something, and there was just all these small technical things that were, like, derailing him. And then they took his computer in to get, like, more RAM and stuff like that, and then he sent me this picture. I got it at, like, 6 in the morning, but basically he went down to his studio to work, like, first day his computer's working, he can finally start tracking vocals, and the repair place didn't fix the glass screen on his iMac properly, and it just fucking slid off and smashed all over his desk.
Oh my
So
God.
he came down in the morning and his screen was just fucked, and he I think he just sent me a text and he's just like, "This is like this might put me over the edge." But then, a couple days later, he's got a new computer, he got everything sorted. Him and Nick kind of did some mic shootout stuff, and
Yeah.
then as far as I know, Ian tracked all the vocals himself,
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
and I'm pretty sure he did all the, like, cleanup work too, like,
Wow.
he dialed all of his own stuff, like, maybe Ratz's guy did it, I don't
Yeah.
know, but
Yeah. Yeah.
Ian definitely has the ability to do that stuff, and then I think he tracked a couple extra little, like, ambient guitar things and things like that, and then it basically all went off to Rats, and then, um, about that time, or maybe a week before Rats got it, Dave, their manager, was like, "Do you wanna try and mix do you wanna do, like, a mix, and we'll just see what happens?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course." Like, no
Of
engineer wants to
course.
not no
Yeah.
one doesn't wanna mix it, right?
Yeah.
So I did a mix of Summer Long, and a week went by, and he was just like Dave or Ian messaged me, I can't remember who it was, and they were basically just like, "Look, like, the mix is actually really, really good. Um, like, there's some things that we would maybe wanna change. We're gonna let Rats take a run at it,
Yep.
but can you just send us your version of the mix, and then Rats can kind of work off of that?" Because I had done some stuff to the drums that maybe wasn't in the session or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and then so Rats, I think, ended up remixing it, which I was totally fine with. I think
Yeah.
it sounds great.
Yeah.
Um, but then Ian's given me a couple of the other songs to mix for what potentially could be other releases. So I'm
Amazing.
hoping I'm hoping at some point I get one mix on the record. But when you're
I
up against Eric Ratz, it's a bit of a daunting task.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you're right. Yeah, that it's Eric's great. I think you are also great, and I think it's very likely that will happen. That's another parallel. So hopefully
Yeah.
if our lines continue parallel, you're going to be mixing the whole next record.
Yeah, because that's what, like, I guess, which would have been No Fixed Address. You did
Yeah, I think
one,
I
and
did.
then
I did one song on that record.
you did the whole next one, right?
Well, I did 5 on the next one, and then I did 10 on the next one. So
Right. Right, because
so CLA
like
and Randy have
Yeah.
like so no fixed address. I think like 5 or 6 songs were CLA. I think 4 songs were Randy. 1 was me. What was the next record? Feed the Machine. I think it was like 3 Randy, 3 CLA, or 4 CLA, and I think 4 or 5 me, and then CLA mixed 1 on the last record.
Yeah.
So hey man, you got this. It's in the can.
Yeah.
Dude, I love
Let's see,
it.
though.
I love it. Well, I could probably talk to you for another like 3 hours about just really getting in geeky. I won't punish you with that. I do have a couple questions that are in the chat here that I want to throw out there.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, this was a good one. I actually answered it while you were talking, but I thought this was a fucking hilarious question. Rock Beats West asks, "What's your favorite place to eat in the Valley?"
That's a super easy question. My favorite place to eat in the Valley is this place called Amir's Falafel in Studio City.
I know
It's
it. I've never eaten
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, it's like, it was funny because it was like this fucking hole in the wall place.
Yeah.
And Scott took me there one time, and it was just like um it's next to a 7-Eleven and then like an adult video store,
I used to
and
live down the street from that place.
yeah,
Yeah.
and like it just looks shitty on
Yeah.
the outside.
Oh yeah, it does.
He took me there once, and he's like, "You just get the special combo." And I look up at the menu, and there's nothing called special combo. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, just get that." And it's what 4 people in front of me in the line, they all
Special
ordered the same
combo.
thing, special combo. And I ate it once, and I'm like, "Yeah, okay, I'm into this now." And it's funny, like, every so often I like go on to Google, and I'm like, "Is Amir still there?" And they're still there like 20 years later.
Yeah.
Maybe they're still good, maybe they're not. But yeah, I would say Amir's Falafel,
Love
or
that.
like, at least for me, like, I think In-N-Out was better back then than it is now.
Yeah.
And then if it was Burbank, it would probably be Ribs USA, which was like Kid
so
Rock's
good.
favorite place over by like the Warner Brothers lots
Yep.
and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I answered while you were talking, and there was a place. Well, it's not Ribs USA, but it's a barbecue place. It's like a highbrow barbecue place in Sherman Oaks called Boneyard Bistro. I don't think they were there when you lived there.
No.
Because I remember distinctly it was like a new restaurant.
Yeah.
And that I salivate. And Paquito Moss. Paul, he just said it. Paquito Moss. Paul DeCarly you were the first one to take me to Paquito Moss. I think I ate Baja Fresh like 5 days a week for the first 4 months I lived in LA. And
I ate a lot of Baja Fresh too,
I ate a
actually.
shit ton of Baja Fresh. And I remember one night, Paul's like, "Oh, fuck, enough with the Baja Fresh. Can we go and have some like actually good Mexican food?" And so Paul took me to Paquito Moss. And I was actually about to say that when I put Boneyard Bistro, I'm like, I should also put Paquito Moss. Me and my wife, to this day, if I go upstairs right now and say to my wife, be like, "Bet you could go for some Paquito Moss right now," she'd be like, "Oh God, like we miss Paquito Moss a lot."
When I lived in LA, I hung out with a bunch of guys who were from like Lake Elsinore, like Inland Empire area.
Yep.
And they took me to so many burrito trailers and stuff
Yeah.
that like Mexican food is ruined for me, because
I know.
every time I that SoCal Mexican food is so good. Like, I don't care if it's authentic or not. It's fucking great in
Yeah.
pretty much anywhere
Yeah.
in that whole city. Yeah.
Yeah. There's varying degrees of authenticity. Like, again, a Canadian going down to LA, Baja Fresh is fucking authentic. Well,
Yeah.
and then when you realize Baja Fresh is actually like the McDonald's of Mexican food
It's like the
restaurants.
Arby's of Mexican
Yeah,
food.
exactly. Well, then Paquito Mas is kind of like the next step, and you're like, oh no,
Yeah.
this is really authentic. And then once you get through Paquito Mas, well, then you start going to the food carts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Okay, that was a great question, and I love the fact Paul put in the chat here Paquito Mas. That's awesome because I was literally about to say that. Oh God, I love it. I miss LA. I miss LA so much. Here's a really good question, and you kind of touched upon a few things, but maybe there's one that this will kind of just spark something. A Hammer asked what's something Nick suggested that you ended up using that was new to you or surprised you.
There was actually one thing. So, and this, I wouldn't say it necessarily has changed my philosophy on bass, but it definitely made me think more about what matters in the bass signal, I guess. So we were tracking bass and everything was going good, and then we were kind of just trying to like get a little bit more low end out of the bass, or like not even low end, like kind of just like definition, I guess.
Yep.
And Nick just like casually said, he's like, "Yeah, I don't know which ones they are, but they're the pull techs that are like the mid range ones, not like the normal ones, but the ones
MEQ. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like whatever the fuck." And he was just like, "Yeah, sometimes I boost 200 hertz on those on bass."
Mm.
And in my head, I was just like, "That's weird," because I usually cut 200
Yeah.
hertz,
Oh,
like, to
dude.
make it clear.
Yeah.
And he was just like, "No, you should try it." And then, like, we did, and I'm like, "Holy fuck, like, that actually works so well."
Yeah.
And, I think it boils down to that whole thing, like, the numbers on those pull techs are meaningless. They don't actually it's not actually 200 hertz. It's probably, like, 50 all the way to 1,000 or something like
Yeah.
that.
Probably.
It's more of a volume control than anything. But, yeah, like, we just turned it up, like, 2 or 3 dB, and then Dave was just like, "Yeah, that fixes everything." Like,
You know what?
and that
That's interesting. When I say lately, over like I'd say the last couple years, I've been doing like when mixing, and this is one of those things. Like I got to be really disciplined. Like I'm so not practicing what I preach, and I've kind of caught myself. I've been boosting weird fucking frequencies on bass guitars, and I'm like, that can't be right. I do it, and I'm like, that sounds good, and then I almost like try to talk myself out of it. I'm like, when the fuck have I ever wanted, like exactly what you said, you're like, when have I ever wanted more 200 hertz in anything?
yeah.
And I've been doing that lately. Like I'll get to the end of a mix and I'll be just like, yeah, the bass is just like almost like I hear, like I know it's in there, but it's very undefined. It's like sub and then it's guitars and that's it. And then I start like just cranking like even like 160 hertz or 180 hertz or just finding whatever that bass is. And I'm like, fuck, that solves that problem. And then I'm like, no, that's wrong. That's so wrong. You can't do that. You shouldn't be doing that. And I almost try to talk myself out of it. So that actually, you saying that kind of gave me a little bit of a like, oh shit, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like,
So,
to kinda bring this whole thing full circle, like, that was a big thing with Ben, like, I don't know how he did it, but Ben had this like, all of Ben's best mixes, like the Starset stuff and the Breaking Benjamin and all that kinda stuff,
yeah.
he's got, like, way more 120 to 150 than any other mixer, and I think that's what gives it, like, the weight
Yes.
that a lot of other people don't, and, like, like, Staub had a lot of weight, but Ben's is different, and I
Very different.
swear it's like he doesn't cut as much in that range, or, like, he boosts around it, I don't know, but it's just and, like, I saw a CLA video, and he was talking about how, like, he never cuts mid-range on or low mids on bass because he's like, "That's where the note is."
Yes. Note.
And in my
Note.
head, I'm like,
Yeah.
"I always do." I'm like, "Wait a minute, have I been doing this wrong the whole time? Like, is that
I
what's
know.
going on right now?"
I know. Well, see, that's we're all always learning and figuring shit out. And I think like again, I'm talking more about me than anybody else. There's so many scenarios where it's like, well, I know what I need to do, and then you get this like weird voice or a little other guy on the other side being like, you can't do that. That's bad. And you're
Yeah.
like, no, just fucking do it. Use your ears. So I love that. Got another question for you. Somebody asked in here, I don't want to spend too much time on this. We were talking about the tuning, and somebody says, what's your opinion on Evertune? I will quickly say I've got a couple guitars with Evertune guitars. I didn't buy Evertune guitar, like I didn't buy them with it in. I feel like one of them is wrecked. I feel like one of the guitars does not sound good anymore, but it stays in tune. And the other guitar used to be one of my favorite guitars to play, and now it's not. But when I'm working with a player who has a really hard time with tuning, or you're doing quad tracking and whatever, I do keep them around because they work for keeping it in tune. I know a lot of guys who love them. My experience with them is, yes, it fixes the tuning problems. I think I really wish I just would have bought one from them, and that was my Evertune guitar. I feel like I wrecked two really great guitars putting them on, but I think they're good for what they do. So
I have one. It works great, but I fucking suck shit at guitar. So for me, it works really well. But when we were at Chad's house, Chad put one in Ian's hands, and Ian was just like, "What the fuck is that?" He was just like, "Nope." Like he didn't even. He was just like, "Take this fucking thing away from me
bizarre.
right now."
Yeah. Especially for a guy like that. Like it is weird. I'm not a good guitar player, and they're a little weird for me too.
Yeah. I think though it's like they definitely serve a purpose for me where
it's a tool.
like if a player is so bad that I'm concerned about the tuning,
Yeah,
their tone is for sure going to be terrible anyways.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I remember I was on, I can't remember, it might have been Pensato's place like years ago, and it was like probably episode 12. And somebody asked, they're like, "Oh, what's your favorite guitar for tracking?" And I said, the one that stays in tune. And there have been a lot of albums that I've done where tone is the last thing we care about, and tuning is the first 5 things we care about.
Yeah.
And so in that scenario, I think they're great. And I will caveat, I have friends who do have Evertune guitars that they sound good and they feel okay to play. I'm just saying the ones that I got, and maybe it was an install problem, maybe it was maybe just because I knew how the guitar played and felt and sounded before I went and sent it to get done. And then I got it and I was like, shit, that fucking ruined this guitar. But anyways, we don't have to talk about that too much. Paul DeCarli's got actually a good question, and I think he was being slightly sarcastic, but I think it's a good question anyways. And he asked it to both of us. This is a 2-part question. What do you love most and hate most about Pro Tools right now? Why don't we start? Let's start with the hate. What do you hate the most about Pro Tools right now? The current version.
Current version, really simple stuff. Like, how the fuck can we not import FLAC files? Right? Like that's, for me, that's silly. But like in terms of functionality, I don't know. Like MIDI's still a little weird.
Yeah.
And no, I take it back. I know 100%.
Okay.
Sorry, it dawned on me.
There we go.
The new Melodyne ARA.
Yeah, brutal.
I don't know how much of you've used it, but
brutal.
you get that saving ARA thing
all
every
the
time it tries to do a session backup.
Yeah.
Nope.
No.
I'm out. I use the plug.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too. Yeah, 100%. I tried it and I was like, you can't work. It's impossible to work. And apparently on the newest version they said they fixed it and it's a little bit better, but it's still not good. It still does it. It just does it faster now. And it's like, no. You guys got to get rid of this. Like you got to lose it. And so again, the only way to do it is, I guess, to turn your backups off, or your automatic
Who's
backups.
gonna do that?
Who the fuck's going to do that? Yeah, crazy. All right, so that's your hate. I will concur. I probably have a different answer, but I will second that. What is the thing about Pro Tools that you love in this current version?
So current version, one small quality of life change they made was being able to color the inputs and outputs now.
That was nice.
So my template just aesthetically is very pleasing, where everything has a certain color and I can tell all that stuff. But in terms of like feature, I don't know. I mean, I could probably make a record on Pro Tools 7 or 8 and be okay with what I use it for.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have elastic audio, and I'd have to do fades slowly in Beat Detective, but that's about it. Like I'm definitely not like I'm not using that sketch pad thing. I'm not.
I haven't even looked
Yeah,
at it. I don't
I
even know what
tried
it
it and
is.
it's a disaster. Um, but no, I honestly, like, for me, and maybe I'm very biased, I'm probably like 30 or 40,000 hours into Pro Tools, like, it just kinda
Holy,
works for me now.
yeah,
I don't have to think about it at all. Yeah,
yeah.
so I don't know. I don't have a favorite. I'm curious what yours
Um,
are.
well, a couple favorites, and people. It's not super like current version. Okay, so the colored inputs and outputs were good, and actually, that when they announced it, I'm like, whatever. So what? And actually, my mix assistant Irene, she was like, oh, we should update your template with the colors, and I'm like, whatever. And then I went and did it, and I'm like, this is awesome. Like it actually does help. And I think it also like just made like the mix setup. It's another layer of, okay, this is going to the right spot. Um,
Yeah.
so which is nice. So I do like that. The Melodyne ARA, not good. I'm still having, I will sum up with the thing I hate most about Pro Tools right now is I still have bugs that I've had for 10 years. Man, if I open my email right now, I've got a folder of support tickets with various bugs. Oh, I just thought of one, but this might be this might be operator error. But anyways, I have a folder of support tickets that open with Avid, where it goes something like this. Sporadically in my sessions, a track should be playing and it's not, or a stereo track, one side is not producing audio, and there's no explanation. And so what I'll do is I'll make a new track and I'll copy that down onto it, and now that will play fine, but now the next track in line will not play.
Oh, weird.
And it's like it's this puzzle piece game of trying to get the track that's not working just be on a it's like a duplicate of something that I just have muted and only one side's playing. It's fucking bizarre. And this happened to me 10 years ago. Like I could show you the support ticket from 10 years ago. So here's what happens. They say, oh, okay, we need more information. I make a video. I give them all the logs they need, this, that, and the other thing. They say, okay, send me the session. I'm like, this is like a fucking major label client session that's not even done. I can't send you this session.
Yeah.
And then they're kind of like, well, unfortunately, we're not able to recreate this on our end. So I'm like, this has been like this for 12 years. This happened to me 12 years ago. And this is still happening. And they can't figure it out. I have videos of it. I take a screenshot video every time it happens. It happened to me 3 days ago. And I'm just like, fuck. And of course, it never happens on these just like, oh, I'm writing a song.
It's always something important.
It's always something important. I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't send this to you. And the other problem is the minute you make a new track, it jumps to another track. And then you might open it 3 days later and it's fine. So I would just say my overall hate is there are still gremlins. And I don't expect any software to be completely bug-free. I'm very realistic about that. And actually, I'm actually relatively impressed how little Pro Tools crashes these days. Not that it doesn't crash; it still crashes. But it used to be like every couple hours you would expect it, and now I can go a day, and if it crashes once or twice, I'm pretty happy. The things I love, I think, the most about the current Pro Tools, and I'm saying current versus like kind of what you were talking about. Like we've been using Pro Tools forever, so current almost seems like anything in the last 4 or 5 years. But like something like commit and freeze and track presets for me are huge. I'm trying to think if there's something in the latest version of Pro Tools that I really dig. You know what? I've been so busy lately. Like I used to, when there would be a new version of Pro Tools or any software for that matter, I'd usually have like, oh, I've got an evening tonight. I'm gonna spend 4 hours learning that new thing. I've got kids, so it's like anytime I got 4 hours in the evening, which is not often enough. It's like, I'm not going to spend it on the computer learning how to fucking use the Sketchpad and Pro Tools. I'm going to, go spend it with my family. So I've been pretty bad about that. But I will say just like some of those functionality things like commit, freeze. I think that's those things for me just made things so much easier. I remember having to like route to another track and like recording it in real time. I was like, what the fuck? We used to do that. And I'm like, yeah, so not having to do that anymore is pretty awesome. So, this could be a whole, Paul, we're going to have to, when you're on, exactly. Paul says, oops, I started an emotional breakdown. Well, when Paul is going to be on the live stream at some point soon. And I think we have to commit to an hour of love, hate. And we'll do that. Lots of positive comments for your work on and Nick's work on the record. Great record. Any new projects coming up for you that you're excited about? I mean, we're always working on new stuff, but is there anything kind of new, notable that you're like, oh yeah, I'm looking forward to that, or that's something that you've done recently that you want to share? Or
I'm actually kind of in an interesting spot right now where I'm actually most excited for. I'm on the tail end of a couple projects, and I'm gonna actually have time to like maybe find a new pet project or like,
nice.
something that I can sink my teeth into a little bit more.
Yep.
Because I haven't been able to do that pretty much since, I don't know, 2021 or something like that, or
Yeah.
2022.
Yeah.
So what I'm really looking forward to is like finding a baby band and developing something
Nice.
new. I have other records I'm working on right now that are like, they're pretty fun.
Yep.
And I enjoy working on them and all that stuff, but I kind of want to find something completely different that I don't normally work on and try something new.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Very
I
cool.
think that's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. I think that's a nice way to kind of change a little bit of our perspective and just kind of switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, do you use elastic audio on guitars? Sometimes on acoustic guitars. I mean, I use elastic audio only when I need to.
Yeah, I honestly, the only time I use elastic audio is if vocal line really fucks something up.
Yeah.
And then I tried an elastic audio.
Are you still chopping like a lot of, like if you have to dig in and do a lot of editing, are you just still doing kind of like manually with, trying to line up waveforms and fade in and just move stuff around? Or are you doing a lot of time stretching?
It depends. Like if I'm the person running Pro Tools, I will do a lot of that stuff on the fly.
Yeah, me too.
Where like if something is not long enough, I'll just say, hey, can you sing that longer? Or I'll just trim I'll do a lot of it.
Yeah.
But if it's after the fact, sometimes I'll do it manually, sometimes I do vocal line. It really comes down to like how many layers there are, and am I about to spend 30 hours lining up 80 pop vocals and like something that vocal line can do in 5 minutes flat.
Yeah.
Elastic audio, though, I gotta be honest, I use elastic audio when something's a problem.
Well, I've got about 14 support tickets for the same elastic audio bug. So
perfect.
I think I posted one on my YouTube channel in like fucking 2007 and it still exists. So that's another one where you go and you set all your markers or whatever they're called, the warp markers, and then you hit quantize and they move but not anywhere close to the bar or the beat.
Yeah.
And I'm like, where are these going? And then but if you manually grab them and drag them to the like the beat, no problem. But the quantize puts them in weird fucking spots. And apparently they can't figure that out either. They need me to send them a fucking a half finished album that I would probably lose my career if those tracks got leaked somewhere. So anyways,
exactly.
Okay, guys, I think we're gonna wrap this up. If there, I'll kind of do a little outro here. If there's any last minute questions, Chris, dude, you are a champ. We're 3 hours plus. Well, I guess, you did 14-hour days with Ian Thornley. You can do it.
Yeah, this is fucking nothing.
Exactly. You're like, I got another 11 hours in me. This has been a blast. Long time coming. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be in Vancouver for, but at some point here, we definitely got to go. Long overdue dinner, and I'd love to pick your brain on some more stuff. And like I said, at some point, I'll be launching kind of more of an official podcast. I'd love to have you on that as well. And
sure, man, this is fun.
This is great. If for anybody watching, if you guys aren't following Chris on Instagram, I believe I put his Instagram handle in the description. Definitely follow him. He's always working on really cool stuff. And yeah, man, like I said, can't thank you enough for coming on. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It was great.
And I think I'm going to try to do another live stream next week. I don't know. Maybe Paul will come on. He just said, "Well done, boys. Cheers." Paul, what's your next Friday looking like? We'll figure that out. But thank you to everybody for sticking with us. Thank you for watching. Definitely, if you've got any questions that we didn't get to, hit me up, hit Chris up on his Instagram. And yeah, love it. Thank you, Chris.
All right, man. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Be happy. And until next time.